A few months ago, my neighborhood began having a rodent problem. Aside from the usual raccoons that would get into some of the trash cans left out on curbs or by garages, people began to notice an increase in rats. Thankfully, not many made it into the actual homes, but the damage to exteriors, pipes, and wiring was beginning to get out of hand after various angry phone calls from residents on my street, myself included. We finally had someone come out and do some sort of inspection. Hannah Tillman was the one who met with him in person and later relayed the information to the rest of us. She'd taken the day off and admitted that she felt insulted at first because the man who showed up seemed uninterested in what she tried to tell him. Once he saw those garden pipes the Rutgers family has in their garden are all chewed up, well, he started realizing we weren't just making this up. He looked at the outside of almost every house up and down the street. But don't worry, he didn't go into any yards that have locks on their fences or anything, she told us that evening. A group of us congregated in her yard, curious to know what was going to be done about our sudden infestation. So what's going to happen now? Damian Sutherland asked. Well, Hannah began, but was cut off by a gruff voice from the porch next door. Go home already. Nobody needs to be out gossiping this much, the old woman's voice interrupted. We all turned to look at the angry, elderly woman standing at the edge of her porch. She had one hand firmly gripped on a cane, and her other palm placed flat against one of the pillars on either side of the steps. Her jaw was set, and she glared at the group. Mrs. Harris, we're just discussing the rat problem. Did you have anything specific you wanted us to share with the people coming to take care of it? Is there any damage to your property that needs to be addressed? A younger woman spoke up. She was my next-door neighbor, a woman in her mid-20s named Caroline Murphy. She'd moved in about a year ago when her father, who owned a home, got sick and needed to be taken care of. He didn't last long, unfortunately, but she inherited the home and decided to stay at least for a while. Although none of us knew her very well, she was always kind, and best of all, she was quiet and respectful. The only rats around here that are a problem are the lot of you interrupting an old woman's slumber. Go home, she exclaimed in a huff. As she began to slowly turn around, likely hindered by her old age, she added, and keep your damn kids and animals out of my yard. They're tearing up my flowers. I pivoted my head a bit and shared a side-eye look with my partner, Lucy. We both knew that this would be a running joke between us later, possibly even shared with the other residents as well. When I was younger, I never bought into the idea that there actually were older people out there who yelled "get off my lawn" or were just crotchety for no apparent reason. That was until I met Mrs. Harris. She was the epitome of a bitter, elderly cliché. She'd lived here since before anyone else could remember being a fixture, even when Damien was growing up 1st. Over. Sometimes a few of us try to guess her age, but we never landed on anything solid. She was timeless and not in that well-made, classic-looking jewelry kind of way. She was also one of the meanest people I'd ever met, finding an issue with anyone and anything. If you walked too close to her gate while even still on the sidewalk, her scratchy and shrill voice would ring out from the porch or one of her windows. If your kids were playing too loudly for her liking, she would yell at you if you were near enough, and if not, or if you tried to ignore her, she would call your home and yell at you. Neighborhood get-togethers had to always take place at least 3 houses away from hers and across the street, or she'd call the cops for her peace being disturbed. As grating and annoying as she could be, though, the residents as a whole tolerated her with a shrug and quietly shared jokes later. We would imitate her voice with whatever recent rant or angry phrase she'd been heard saying and make light of it. After all, she was just a bitter old woman and really didn't do any harm. It was easier to just live with it than try to confront her or get her to change her ways or hell, even just talk to her. After her front door slammed shut, Hannah took a deep breath and let it out in exasperation. As I was saying, some sort of environmental control team or something is going to be sent out next week to deal with the situation. It's been requested that we compile a list of specific areas where the damage has been more severe, so they can try to track the rats to the nest. We talked for a few more minutes, making plans to leave gates unlocked and seeing who might be available to be at home when the team was there to help them out with directions or information if they needed it. Then we all returned to our own homes. That night, though almost as if they knew what we'd been discussing and what was going to happen, the rat struck. I was awoken by Lucy shaking me and whispering in my ear, "Charlie, wake up." Her voice was urgent as it pulled me from my sleep. She raised her voice a bit, and it hit my ear like a loud drum beat. "Charlie, what?" I asked groggily. I sat up and rubbed my eyes. When I could open them enough to focus on anything, I saw her standing beside the bed, cell phone up to her ear. She pointed to the window, and I followed her direction. There was a faint, unusual glow from outside. As my still mostly asleep mind tried to process what was happening, I heard Lucy on the phone with someone. There was a single word that caught my attention: fire. When I heard this, I jumped up and quickly approached the window, looking out. From here, I could see the back of Caroline's house was ablaze. It wasn't a huge inferno or anything, but it was still a house on fire. I rushed to pull some clothes on and darted out the front door, almost running face first into it. In my haste, I left Lucy trailing behind me at a slower pace, on the phone with who I now assumed were emergency services. My main focus, though, was making sure Caroline got out of the house. Once I saw her already standing on the sidewalk, staring forlornly at her home, and the glow that could be seen peeking over the roof, almost like a sunrise or sunset, I let out a breath of relief. "You okay?" I asked her, jogging over to stand beside her. She nodded without looking at me. Lucy joined us a few seconds later, and we stood there in shock until the firefighters arrived. We were ushered away from the scene as they went to work. Lucy offered to make us all some tea, and Caroline joined us on our porch, awaiting news as to how bad the damage was. A little later that night, when Lucy and I were going to bed, I heard a strange melody wafting in from the open window. "What is that?" I asked aloud, mostly to myself. Lucy made a noise from beside me. She was already almost entirely wrapped up in sleep. Instead of waking her up more, I quietly got out of bed and walked over to the window to take a look. Our bedroom window looks out over our backyard and subsequently some of the neighbors' backyards on either side of us. I looked to the left and saw nothing, then looked to the right to Caroline's yard. She was walking around slowly, holding something to her face. As I watched her meander through her grass, I realized she was playing the music with some sort of flute. The song was slow, and I found it familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. It made me think of a meadow filled with swaying grass dotted with flowers, warm sunshine, and a gentle breeze. It was beautiful, and I was impressed. I let myself get lost in the tune until I noticed something moving along the ground near her. I focused my gaze as best I could against the darkness and made out an increasing number of small shapes creeping in the grass towards her. Right as I began to panic and thought about calling down to her, she twirled in a circle, not wavering in her flute playing, and began walking through her back gate and into the trees. The creatures scurried after her, falling into a sort of line as she led them away. I blinked several times, and once I could no longer hear the music, I shook my head and returned to the safety of blankets and pillows. I had to just be dreaming. It took a couple days, but we found out that the rats had chewed through an electrical cord and ultimately caused the fire. Thankfully, it was caught quickly, and the damage wasn't nearly as bad as it could have been. Most of her house was okay, but her kitchen would have to be completely torn up and redone. The next few days, we barely saw Caroline at all. She stayed in her home, opting to have the kitchen sealed off while it was worked on so she could remain there. Honestly, I didn't think much of her chosen solitude until Lucy pointed out that there were new additions to Caroline's front porch. "They're interesting, don't you think?" Lucy said, looking at the 3 fresh adornments as we walked past Caroline's house. "What are they?" I asked her. She shrugged. "They look kind of like wind chime, maybe." Right then, the front door opened and Caroline emerged, holding another one of her decorations. She saw us and waved before reaching up to hang it. "Were those Care?" Lucy called to her, turning to walk up the walkway instead of continuing to our home. "Oh, they're wind chimes," the young woman said. "That's what I thought." "They aren't metal, though," Lucy replied. No, these are made from men." She paused for a second as she seemed to try to think of the right word. "Organic material." I followed Lucy to the porch and looked at the items with her. They definitely appeared to be wind chimes of some sort, but the pipes that usually were made from metal cylinders were small and colored. When I say small, I actually mean tiny. It was like they were made for fairies or something. I couldn't place what the material was, but I noticed on some of them that there were intricate designs carved into them: loops and spirals, leaves and vines, and even some geometric style patterns. They weren't brightly colored or painted, but looked to be softly stained with something. Each of the 4 sets had a different color scheme, subtle and not tacky. Wow, was all I could say. Caroline beamed. "They're handcrafted too," she said. "Really? Even all these little designs?" Lucy asked, admiring a set that was done in tones of blues and purples. "Yeah, it takes a very steady hand and some time, but I wanted to give them something more unique," Caroline answered. "You made these?" I asked. Caroline nodded and smiled. "Oh my, that's incredible, Care," Lucy told her. "How do you make them?" At this, Caroline's smile faltered for just a split second, almost imperceptibly, then returned with a slyness to it. "I'm afraid it's an artist's secret. If you'll excuse me, though, I have dinner waiting inside." "Talk again soon," she said in a cheery voice and waved as she strode into her home. Lucy looked at me with a slightly confused or concerned expression. I held my hand out to her and shrugged. "Maybe this is how she's coping with everything," I said, leading Lucy away from the porch and over to our own home. She made a noise and spared one last look at Caroline's chimes before giving her own shrug. When the environmental team showed up at the end of the week, Hannah was again the one who handled meeting them and letting them know what information she'd gathered from all of us. She told us later that day about the visit and that all of the damage to the property had been inspected. She informed us that they didn't find much in the way of rats themselves, but thought they'd found where the nest was located. They did whatever they could to handle such a situation and expected it to be resolved soon, as there were signs of the rat population seeming to dwindle already. They suggested that the rats could have started migrating to another area in search of more bountiful scurrying grounds, but as far as they could be sure, there just weren't that many rats expected to be remaining. We all took the good news to heart and looked forward to a rat-free ST. We even began planning some sort of Rat Be Gone potluck to take place one weekend soon. Within a couple of weeks, flyers began appearing on poles and slipped into mailboxes. Pets were going missing. Our street was affected, but it seemed to be more the surrounding streets that were undergoing this sudden and strange influx of runaway cats and dog disappearances. When Paul Garland's pet chihuahua vanished from the end of the street, I noticed that Caroline gifted him one of her unique wind chimes. It was a little larger than her first ones, as her recent ones had begun to vary in size, and it was dyed to match the little white and brown friend he'd lost. It was sweet, I thought. She did the same for the Friedman when their fluffy white cat never came home from his evening romp. It was when I was driving around the neighborhood myself the day before yesterday, looking for our Sheba that had darted off. I realized that Caroline's interesting chime creations adorned several homes in the immediate area. I didn't know all of these people, but I recognized a few of the houses to be families that had missing pets. Had she really been spending so much time customizing sets of wind chimes for each of these families? It was an extremely thoughtful thing to do, but she must have been working around the clock. I gave up my search after a couple of hours and returned home feeling a bit defeated. I decided to give one more pass around the backyard to see if there were any holes I missed that our mischievous Gary could have dug and slipped through. As I walked the perimeter, I absent-mindedly squeezed one of his toys in my hand. It was his favorite, a soft but sturdy duck plush with a squeaker inside that honestly drove me nuts. At that moment, though, all I wanted was for him to jump up, grab the toy from me, and go hide in a corner and squeak it until I couldn't stand the sound anymore. A soft bark met my ears, and I perked up, looking around. I wasn't sure where it had come from, but it definitely sounded like my Gary buddy. I made the toy squeak again and listen hard. The bark was muffled, but it was definitely there, coming from the direction of Caroline's backyard. I stood on my toes and tried to peer over the fence, wondering if he had somehow snuck back there. I couldn't see anything, but I heard a whimper and another bark, this one more frustrated than before. Without thinking, I rushed back through the gate that separated the front of the house and the backyard, and ran over to Caroline's backyard. Part of her fence had been damaged from the fire and still remained a charred heap. I hopped over the pile of wood and squeaked the toy again, hoping for another sound to tell me if I was on the right track. As expected, there were more dog noises, a couple of barks, followed by a few whimpers. Continuing this method, I followed the sounds to the large shed that Caroline had at the back of her yard. As I neared it, I heard scratching against the door from inside. I grabbed the handle and yanked it open to have Gary leap out. He whined at me as he looked at his toy, desperately wanting it. I picked him up and held it while he mouthed at it. "Thank goodness, buddy. How did you get in?" I stopped mid-question as I looked up to see Caroline walking toward me from the front of the house. "Charlie?" she asked, her tone sounding a bit nervous. "Sorry, Caroline, this little guy somehow got himself stuck in your shed. I've been looking for him all afternoon, and I was worried he was going to be like one of those other animals that haven't turned up." I explained quickly. "Oh, I wonder how he got stuck in there. Maybe he snuck in without me knowing somehow when I was working earlier and got shut in," she said. There was something about her voice. It sounded odd, and it made me a bit nervous. I looked back into the shed and saw jars full of some colored liquids, paint brushes, carving tools, desk lamps, and some other items that I didn't take the time to mentally inventory. "Is this where you work?" I asked her, taking a step away from the shed. She nodded, her eyes fixed on Gary. He'd gone quiet and calm, holding on to his toy in his mouth with his head down, hanging over my arm. "He's such a beautiful dog," Caroline said, and closed the gap between us, reaching out to touch Gary. When I looked at her, her eyes were completely white, as if rolled into the back of her head. I froze, but Gary then sprang to wiggling life, and it was difficult to keep a hold of him. She pulled her hand back in surprise. When I looked at her again, her eyes were normal, and I couldn't be sure if I'd really seen anything, or if my mind was playing some sort of creepy trick on me. "I think he's probably pretty hungry and thirsty by now. I better get him home," I told her with a quick, forced smile as I walked away, doing my best to not let the writhing dog loose. I hurried into the house and set him down, then locked the door behind me. "You found him?" Lucy exclaimed. "Yeah," I answered, breathing hard a couple times. "He was in Caroline's shed. I wonder how he got in there," Lucy said. She knelt on the floor and he bounded into her open arms. They stayed there, Lucy giving him a plethora of belly rubs and ear scratches as I made sure he had a fresh bowl of water and food. As I stood at the sink filling the water dish, I glanced out of the window and saw Caroline standing in the doorway to her shed. I couldn't see her face as she stared into it, but I watched as she turned around and looked at our house, anger on her face. "Hon, I know this is going to sound insane." I started, setting the water bowl down. Lucy followed Gary into the kitchen and sat on a stool at the island. "Tell me," she said. I leaned against the island opposite her and spoke. "What if Caroline has something to do with the pets going missing?" She seemed put off by me finding Gary, and it was in her shed too. Thinking about it, she's been kind of strange lately, and I think everyone she's gifted those wind chimes to has a missing animal. And think about the rats. They started disappearing before those people even showed up. Are you just jumping to conclusions because you were worried about Gary, or are you actually concerned about this?" she asked me. She never told me I was crazy, or that my ideas or thoughts were outrageous. Instead, she tried to help me logic my way through my more out-there musings and anxiety, and I loved her for that. I guess I could be, but I'm not entirely sure right now. The timing just seems. Animals go missing, and suddenly she's making these organic wind chimes. It just strikes me as unusual, at least, I told her. She nodded, taking in my words. "All right, here's what we can do. We have no proof that she's linked. Gary could have easily gotten over there, I'm sure, so that isn't a good basis for accusing her of anything. The wind chimes could have been a hobby she's had for a long time that just recently was sparked anew, especially given the loss of her father and part of her house. She could be giving some out as a kind gesture, and each one she custom makes based on a lost pet gives her a specific reason to keep making them. So how about we keep an eye out for now and make sure that Gary is never alone outside? Even if he needs to go out at night, one of us will walk around the yard with him. If she had nothing to do with his adventure today, that means that there could still be a hole somewhere or a way he got out himself. Sounds like a plan? Yes, thank you." I leaned over the island more, and she met me with a kiss. That night, as we got ready to go to bed, I offered to take Gary out once more. I walked around with him in the backyard, watching him sniff around for a spot. As we neared the side fence that separated our yard from Caroline's, my ears began picking up some sort of noise. I walked to the back corner of my fence, following the sound, and pressed my ear against the fence, aiming to try and get a better listen through the tiny space between wood planks. I heard things being moved around in harsh, almost whispering noise. It took me a moment to realize it was Caroline's voice. She sounded angry and maybe even a little fearful. They took it from me. They took it, and now I have no material tonight, she ranted. Gary trotted up to me and distracted me while I shushed him. He sat down by my feet and looked up at me curiously. I smiled at him and then put my ear to the fence again. She was still speaking, but I wasn't able to make out what she was saying, as whatever she was moving around was too noisy. A moment later, I heard the door to the shed slam shut and something with what sounded like wheels being moved across the grass. "I'll have to find another," she grumbled to herself as she passed the fence where I stood. I held my breath until the sounds from her side faded and disappeared altogether. What the hell was that? I asked Gary. His response came in the form of him bounding across the yard back to the house. I sighed, feeling uneasy, but followed. I had no idea what she was talking about. But I decided if another animal went missing, I would start poking around her place to try and get some answers, if not confront her directly. The more I thought about it on the short walk to the house, the more I considered that those wind chimes could be made of bone, specifically bones from the missing animals. She had made tiny ones when it was just the rats, and as pets went missing, the sizes had changed and not been uniform anymore. I tried to push the thought from my mind, but it wouldn't let go of the hold it had on me. I felt my eyes well up and wondered if I hadn't found Gary, would we have been the next home to be gifted with those chime sets? This time dyed in colors to match his fur, made possibly from his own bones. I shook my head as I opened the door and let Gary inside, then followed him. I needed proof before I jumped to any conclusions. I could just still be emotional from missing him during the day. I would worry about it the next day. Right now, I just needed to rest, recharge, and clear my mind so I didn't get too crazy. There could easily be some sort of explanation for everything. When I woke up yesterday morning, I did feel refreshed, calmer, and not like my anxiety was ruling my thoughts. In short, I felt I could handle the situation and simply talk to Caroline after work to get some answers and make sure she was doing okay. She'd been through some difficult moments in the past year and could just be depressed and trying to cope with everything the only way she knew how. I was feeling compassionate and determined instead of nervous. That was until I was driving home from work and turned onto our street. There were police cars parked along the road and officers speaking to a few of the residents. In Miss Harris's driveway sat an ambulance with the paramedic standing outside, talking to some of the cops. I pulled up to my own home, and Lucy greeted me outside. "What happened?" I asked, and gestured to the scene on the street. She shrugged and shook her head. After changing into some more comfortable clothes, I sat with her on the front porch as we watched everything. After about half an hour, an officer approached our house and began to ask us questions about Mrs. Harris, the last time we might have seen her. Did she have any relatives that came over that we knew of? And so on. "She really keeps to herself and doesn't like people," Lucy said. "Did something happen to her?" I asked. The officer sighed and closed the notebook he'd been jotting things in before looking at us directly and answering. "When the weekly nurse came to check in on her today, he found some signs of a possible injury or a fall. Mrs. Harris was nowhere in the house or on the property. There is a concern that she got hurt and confused and wandered off somewhere. So far, we aren't aware of any nearby relatives or friends that she might have gone to. So along with searching the area, we're trying to find any leads to a familiar place someone in her possible condition might go to." After a few more minutes of conversation about Mrs. Harris and anything we might be able to remember she might have mentioned at some point, he gave us a card and thanked us for our time. The search continued into the night, and with no sign of Mrs. Harris anywhere, many people in the neighborhood pitched in and searched the surrounding woods for a few hours, despite her being mean to everyone. The following morning, some of us reconvened outside Mrs. Harris's house and began planning on where to look. I'd originally planned to help out for an hour before work, and then come back and help more if it was needed after. I did help this morning, even after what I saw. I didn't want to alarm anyone else after all, but I don't think I'll be helping the search anymore. At this point, I honestly don't know what to do. I'm not sure if I should go to the police with my concerns and possibly insane thoughts, if I should alert the rest of the neighbors, or try to handle it myself. I'm scared, though. I'm scared that if I try to do anything, it won't end well for me with a potential escalation that I noticed. On Mrs. Harris's porch this morning was a set of bone-colored wind chimes, carved with rushed patterns and symbols, larger than any of the other sets Caroline had made so far. I did end up mentioning to the police about the strange appearance of the chimes on every porch that had a missing pet, and then Mrs. Harris's porch. They didn't seem to put much stock in how strange I found it. I was sure to not make myself sound too insane when conveying my concern. They didn't test the material, but an officer did speak with Caroline. I noticed the police cruiser parking outside of her house, so naturally, I positioned myself at a window where I could see her front door and porch. I watched as the officer knocked on her door, and Caroline answered. It was the first time I'd actually seen her in at least 2 days. I'd heard her working in her shed, but I'd never caught her going between the house and her workspace. She hovered in the threshold of her front door as the two of them talked briefly. I couldn't see her face directly, but I could tell from her profile that she was smiling. I saw her laugh heartily, and then gesture for the officer to come inside. My heart pounded as they entered the house, and the door shut behind them. There was no way she turned him into another wind chime, was there? It was too risky, I thought, trying to comfort myself. After about 2 minutes, I moved around the interior of my own home, searching each window for a glimpse of some sort of sign of Caroline and the cop. Not having any luck downstairs, I rushed up the stairs, almost slipping and face planting as I went. I knew the small balcony off of the bedroom would be the best option, so I quickly, and as quietly as possible, opened the door and stepped outside. I searched her house with my eyes and finally saw movement in her backyard around the shed. The officer was stepping out of her makeshift workshop and handing some papers back to her. She took them with a shrug and smile as she shut the door behind her. It was difficult to hear exactly what they were saying, but I heard her tell him that she wished she could be of more help and that if he wanted, he could go around the house instead of through it. He looked like he thanked her and wished her a good day. As he turned to walk through the gate separating her backyard from the front of the house, she paused and looked directly at me, as if she somehow already knew that I was there. The kind smile she'd had for the police officer turned venomous in an instant, and when we locked eyes, I saw the same eerie, a white looking back at me. My stomach dropped, and I stepped backward into my bedroom, nearly slamming the door as I went. That night, I heard the flute again. Because of my nerves, I was already having trouble sleeping. I tossed and turned, plagued by flashes of terrifying images involving Caroline covered in blood, giggling as she slaughtered Mrs. Harris. I didn't notice the music itself at first. Lucy was asleep beside me, but sudden movement from her side of the bed caused me to roll over. She had sat up and began to hum a tune of some sort. I softly asked her what was wrong, and when I received no answer, I reached for my phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it on her carefully so as not to shine it directly in her face. I saw that her eyes were still closed. Her body started swaying from left to right in time with the song she was humming. It was a song I'd never heard before. I was about to touch her, the only surefire way to wake her, when I realized she was humming along with an outside source. I got out of bed and listened. The melody was coming from outside, so I went over to the open window and looked around in the dark. It was difficult to see clearly, but I could make out Caroline's form in her backyard, playing the flute again. It wasn't the same as before. This time the music she was making was a bit slower and more melancholy. It didn't conjure up thoughts of a peaceful meadow or sunshine. It actually didn't make me think of anything, except that it sounded extremely creepy when combined with my wife's humming coming from the bed behind me. That was only intensified when I heard Gary adding in his own howls to match the song. The three of them were creating this unsettling chorus that stirred up some sort of inherent terror from deep within me. It just felt wrong. The song was just wrong. Without any explanation, I felt like this was a melody that wasn't meant to be played. Honestly, I had no idea how to react to this. Without a word and kind of feeling dazed, I slid the window shut and went downstairs to try and quiet Gary. When I reached the living room, I found him curled up on his bed, his head lifted to the ceiling as a howl tapered off. "Hey, buddy, can we, uh, not do that?" I asked him as I leaned down to scratch his head. He looked at me and grunted the way he normally does when he's been woken up. He stretched his entire body and rolled onto his back, turning his head away from me. I muttered an okay. Then, as I turned on my heel and headed back up the stairs to the bedroom, Lucy had stopped swaying now that the music was almost inaudible. I did my best to gently lay her back down on the bed, and she obliged, but the humming continued. I sighed and returned to the window, just in time to see Caroline walking through her back gate. There were no creatures following her this time, but I did notice something else. The light in her work shed was on at first. I was ready to dismiss this as her forgetting to turn it off or leaving it on for some specific reason, but as I was about to turn and get back into bed, a movement caught my attention. The door to the shed was pushed open, and I saw a figure moving around. They stayed in the confines of the structure, so I wasn't able to make out any details, but there was definitely someone moving around in there. After a while of being glued to the spot, I felt my legs starting to ache from being still for so long. I bent my knees and moved my feet around one at a time to loosen them. Then I leaned down to rub my left calf and knee. When I stood back up, I saw the figure emerging from the shed. Finally, I whispered to myself and narrowed my eyes to try and see who it was. An arm emerged first, outstretched and holding a wind chime. It was hard to keep my eyes trained on the person. My eyes kept feeling like they were losing focus, and the edges of everything in my field of view blurred. I blinked a couple of times and squinted. Slowly, the person stepped out of the shed, but their figure was obscured by whatever was happening to my sight. I shook my head and blinked some more, holding my eyes closed for a few seconds, thinking that maybe they were just dry. I opened my eyes and looked down again, willing my body and mind to make out the form. "What are you doing?" Lucy's voice woke me before my eyes even opened. I groaned at the pounding in my head. I was on my back and tried to roll over and reach for my pillow, but felt nothing of the sort. My body was sore and stiff. I opened my eyes to discover that I was on the floor next to the bed. Lucy leaned over my side of the bed, looking down at me. How I managed to mutter, "Did you fall out of bed or something?" She asked. "Why?" I began but trailed off, trying to remember the night before. I sat up quickly at the memory of everything I'd seen. The sudden movement only served to make my head swim, and my brain feel like it was sloshing around in my skull. "Are you okay?" Lucy's voice was groggy, but concerned. I shrugged and then shook my head briefly as I gripped the edge of the bed for support to lift myself off the floor. I sat down on the edge of the bed and bent over, my elbows on my knees, and rested my head in my hands. "I don't feel good," was all I could say. She rubbed my back and told me to sit tight while she got me some water. I couldn't even bring myself to nod. It felt almost like a hangover, except I'd never experienced the feeling of my brains being mush. The headache and nausea, sure, but never the jelly-adjacent sensation I was feeling now. When she returned and sat next to me, I took the glass in both hands and sipped the cold liquid carefully. "I think you should stay home and take it easy today," she suggested. Her suggestion was more of a firm recommendation than a gentle offer. I nodded and laid back down. She took the glass from my hand and placed it on the table before kissing my forehead and bidding me get some rest. The rest of the day passed in a blur of sleeping, pain, and some TV watching in the evening. By the time Lucy was ready to turn in for the night, I'd spent a few hours awake, had dinner, and was feeling a little better. The brain jelly feeling had subsided after the first few hours of added sleep. I still had a headache, but some ibuprofen helped relieve the pressure and pounding quite a bit. Because of the extra rest I'd gotten that day, I wasn't ready to go back to sleep just yet, so I kissed Lucy goodnight and stayed up to watch some more mindless sitcoms. I ended up falling asleep for a short time while I was stretched out on a couch. Gary snuggled up to my stomach. There was a muffled howl that woke me up. I jumped to my feet, startling him completely awake, if he hadn't been before, and eliciting a glare from his sleepy dog face. His ears perked up after a second, and he lifted his head to sniff the air. The sliding door to our back patio was open, leaving just the screen door locked, and I could hear the music from the flute again. Gary huffed and snorted once, before hopping off of the couch and padding over to the door. He sat down and stared in the direction of Caroline's yard, a low growl coming from his throat. I followed him and closed the door, cutting off the sound. His attention immediately turned to something behind us, and he darted back towards the stairs. He was up the entire flight of stairs before I could even put a foot on the first one. As I made my way up, I could hear him whining softly. Once I could see him, I understood why he was so upset. The flute music wafted in lightly from an open window somewhere, and Lucy stood in the hall a couple of feet from the top of the stairs. She was swaying and humming again. I approached her, trying to talk to her calmly and ask her what was wrong. She didn't respond. Gary nudged her leg with his head, but still there was nothing from her. "Lucy, let's get back to bed, yeah?" I said as I gently tried to touch her in order to turn her away and guide her back to our room. She paused her humming and made an unintelligible noise. "Honey, you need to get back to sleep." I continued my attempt to guide her. "No," she said firmly in an uncharacteristically raspy voice. I was taken aback for a moment at this and froze. Her previously closed eyes shot open, revealing the same rolled-back white appearance I'd seen on Caroline twice before. She shoved me forcefully away from her. As I tried to find my footing, I ended up tripping backwards over Gary, who yelped slightly and then ran. I caught myself just before I tumbled down the stairs. It took a moment for me to regain my bearings, and once I righted myself, I saw that Lucy was no longer standing there. I heard the door to her office slam shut, and I rushed after her. She'd locked me out. "Lucy, honey, open the door." "Please open the door," I pleaded. Instead of waiting for too long after I heard things being knocked around inside, I bolted downstairs and grabbed the set of interior keys we kept in a drawer. I returned and unlocked the door as quickly as I could to find the room disheveled. Things were knocked off of her desk, books were on the floor, pens were everywhere, but Lucy wasn't there. The window was wide open with a screen pushed out of it. I looked outside, but I saw no sign of her anywhere. All I could hear was that flute being played. I left the office and went to the bedroom to try and see where Caroline was. By the time I stepped out of the balcony, though, the melody was distant and I saw no movement in the darkness. The light in the shed was on, and the door was open, but it didn't seem as if there was any movement inside. I ran down the stairs, slipped some shoes on, and grabbed Gary's leash. He was sitting by the back door again, still growling. I tried to hook the leash to his collar, but he whimpered and stepped away from me. I didn't have time to deal with convincing him, so I dropped the leash on the floor as I ran out of the front door. I called Lucy's name as I searched around the house and then made my way to Caroline's backyard. There was no sign of Caroline or Lucy or anyone. I briskly walked to the shed and found it empty of life as well. I stepped inside for just a moment, but when I turned around to leave, I felt shoved from behind. I fell to the ground, narrowly missing a nose-first collision with the grass. I felt a weight on top of me, and hands roughly grabbed the sides of my head. I'm not ashamed to admit, I flailed like a fish out of water. On my stomach, I didn't have much leverage, and there were knees pinning down my arms. Not only was it physically difficult to get myself out of this position, but mentally as well. My head was turned to the side, and one of the hands holding my head inched its way to my mouth, fingers prodded, and pulled apart my lips. I struggled to keep my mouth closed, but failed. The fingers felt slimy and tasted how wet dirt and worms smell as they entered, hooking into my cheek. The other hand still held my head in place, against the ground. After holding me there for a moment, the fingers inside my mouth began exploring my teeth, slowly feeling around each one. My vision began to blur and darken, and I knew I could pass out soon. I'd already been out of sorts that day, and this was just adding to that. I went limp for a few seconds, mustering up all of my strength. With one last effort, I attempted to shove the person off of me. Again, I was defeated effortlessly. My head was pressed harder into the ground, and I felt that I couldn't hold on any longer. My world went black. I woke up once again hours later. It might sound stupid, but I was getting annoyed at waking up. I'd slept more than normal, and it felt like every few hours I was re-emerging from the land of nightmares. This time, I found myself still on the ground in Caroline's backyard. The sun was up, but not very high in the sky yet. I got to my feet and stumbled out of the yard into my own front door. I had to call the police. As I left Caroline's property, I saw several police cruisers already lining my street. There wasn't one at my house, but there were at least 4 of them at other ones. I looked at the scene a bit dazed. I felt faint still, and I had to sit down for a moment before I could find out what was going on and let them know that my wife was missing and that I'd been attacked. I neared my own porch steps, planning on sitting on them to rest, when I noticed it. My porch now sported its very own handcrafted, organic wind chime. I'm not entirely sure how long I sat there on my porch steps, feeling numb and broken physically and mentally. There was an officer, accompanied by one of my neighbors, Romero Tillman, Hannah's husband. The officer asked me a few questions, and I ended up relaying the previous night's events to the uncomfortable-looking cop. I was sure to downplay the strange part, so I didn't sound crazy. Romero sat down beside me, and when the officer was satisfied with the information I had given, he explained to me what was going on. His wife, along with Lucy and 4 others on the street, had gone missing overnight. Romero had woken up to find the front door wide open and a wind chime, similar to the one on my own porch, hanging just above his porch steps. 2 of the others had woken up to find their partners leaving the house in the middle of the night in a sort of daze or trance-like state. When they tried to prevent this from happening, they were shoved aside as I'd been. By the time they were able to rush outside to follow their partners, there was no sign of them. So Hannah, Coral, Morgan, Peter, Michelle, and Lucy all vanished in the middle of the night to who knows where. No one seems to have any idea where or why, he concluded, shaking his head. I wouldn't quite say that, I said in a low voice. Romero looked at me with an eyebrow raised. Do you know something? He asked. I nodded slightly, looking around the street. I might, but I don't want to talk about it out in the open. And if you want to know, you're going to have to open your mind quite a bit. It's going to sound insane. We agreed to meet back at my house once the police had finished their questioning. I went inside and took a shower before making a full pot of coffee. When Romero returned an hour later, he had Samantha, Isaac, Carter, and Luke in tow. These were the partners of those that had gone missing. I explained what I knew, what had happened to me, and confirmed that each of them had a wind chime appear somewhere on their porch. I expected disbelief and to be called crazy, but surprisingly, nothing of this sort happened. Each of them took turns explaining the strange behavior their partner had been exhibiting for a day or 2 prior to last night. Carter even explained the wide-eyed look that Peter had when he tried to stop him from leaving. We talked over multiple pots of coffee and several hours, comparing notes, considering theories, and attempting to make plans. In the end, we agreed on one place to start, Caroline. It wasn't like in the movies, where the group of ragtag heroes stomps into battle with determination. We more or less walked at a slow pace, making our way to Caroline's front door. We were unsure of what would happen. And even wanting our partners back wasn't enough to make the fear of what could happen go away. What do you want? Caroline asked angrily when she opened the door. I want my wife back, I said. My own bravery surprised me, and I could feel rage starting to boil inside. I hoped it would continue so that I had the backbone to handle whatever happened. The rest of our little group voiced their own version of the sentence, and Caroline stood there, staring at us for a moment. When her eyes landed on the bump on my forehead and scratches around my mouth, her demeanor completely changed. Where she'd seemed hard and tough before, she crumpled. And I mean she physically crumpled. She fell to her knees, her head buried in her hands, and she began to sob. I didn't know what to do. I looked at Romero and the others with a shrug. They returned my look with confusion. I crouched down and hesitantly touched her shoulder. Her head lifted, and she shifted to a seated position. I didn't know this was going to happen. I don't know how to stop her. I don't even know what she is. I just wanted the rats to go away. We all stayed where we were while Caroline continued to sob for a few minutes. I didn't know what I should do. Here was this dark force that we thought stole our loved ones, openly bawling instead of fighting back. Can you tell us what happened? Romero asked as her cries began to listen. She nodded and glanced over her shoulder, a look of fear evident on her face. Why don't we go to my place? I offered. She looked me in the eye and nodded again fervently. Samantha stepped forward and helped her to her feet. Back in my living room again, we sat around and listened to Caroline's explanation. After the fire, I was upset and angry that the rat issue was out of control. I didn't want to wait any longer or have anyone else get hurt because of them. I was taking a walk, trying to calm down, when I heard someone call to me from the front of a house I was walking past. At first, I thought Mrs. Harris was going to yell at me for being too close to her home, and I was getting ready to yell back at her and tell her what a horrible old woman she is. Instead, she was nice and asked me if I wanted to get rid of the pest. When I told her yes, she let me into her house and made me tea. We talked for a bit, and at first I didn't believe her. She told me that she had a special flute that would entice any and all pests to follow it. I would just have to play it and lead them into the woods. It was a humane and quick way to get rid of the problem. She kept using that word though, pests, not rats or rodents or animals. She told me that she was too old to do it herself. And she offered for me to take the flute and lead them away. I thought she was full of it, but I was also so raw and ready to try anything. If it didn't work, no harm done. If it did, then good. I agreed, and she told me that she'd allow me to take the flute on one condition. I learned how to make wind chimes out of bones. I thought it was strange, but she insisted that she used to make wind chimes out of bones from dead animals she'd found, and that they looked better than I thought. I agreed again, and told her that if the flute worked, I'd let her teach me whatever. Well, it worked. For some reason, it didn't even dawn on me that I not only didn't know how to play a flute, but I didn't know what to play to make the rats follow me. When I held the flute to my lips, though, it was like something else took over my body and began playing through me. After that, the night was a complete blackout for me. I was standing in my backyard, barely starting to play the flute. The next, I was lying on Mrs. Harris's couch. The next day, she showed me how to make the wind chimes, and at first I thought it was kind of neat. She gave me instructions on how to dye the bones, and carve them with strange symbols and designs. Whenever I asked her about the symbols, she'd just say they were there for luck and prosperity or something like that. I began having regular blackouts, especially at night, and when I woke up with fur and blood on my clothes, I suspected that I had something to do with the missing animals. I noticed the wind chimes that would appear wherever there was an animal missing, and I thought I was the one making them and putting them up, but I couldn't remember doing it. The only decorations I personally remember making are the ones that are at my own house. When Mrs. Harris went missing, I panicked and tried to take the flute into the woods to leave it somewhere. It felt wrong to just throw something like that away, but I didn't want it near me anymore. I walked and walked, and finally just left it nestled in the branches of a tree I came upon. The tree itself was surrounded by tiny bones, and I thought it was only right to leave it there. When I got home, though, Mrs. Harris was there in my living room, except she looked younger. I realized she'd been starting to look young already, just by small increment, so it wasn't very noticeable. At that point, though, she looked about 20 years younger. She was angry with me for getting rid of the flute, and when she started yelling at me, these things came out of the shadows behind her. I don't know what they were, but they brought a smell of something burning with them. There were 2 or 3 of them. It was hard to tell. They kept shifting shapes like they were liquid moving through the air. Some sort of dark, murky liquid, kind of like oil, maybe. I was pinned down on my back, and she got on top of me and started poking at my arms and face. Her fingers pressed hard into my skin, and she seemed to be looking for something. When she stopped, she said that my bones were strong, but my spirit wasn't good enough. I needed to help her get strong bones and spirits before I'd be released. But the way she said it made me feel like she wanted to kill me. She forced me up, and I had to lead her into the woods to find the flute. It took a while to find where I'd left it, but once I did, she demanded that I play it. As soon as I started to, I blacked out again. It was just barely night when that happened, and I didn't come until almost noon the next day. My feet were bare and bruised and bloody, my hands were dirty, and my entire body felt sore. I slept for a while longer, trying to rest. Hours later, when I woke up, Mrs. Harris was back again. She didn't say anything, but sat on the edge of my bed and held the flute out to me. I took it and began to play, afraid of what she might do or what she might bring. If I didn't, I remember crying as I took it, and she led me to my backyard. The next thing I knew, I was standing in the woods, surrounded by the missing people. They were sitting on the ground, each of them, with their feet in holes. There was one hole for each foot, and they were in the process of covering the holes, with their feet inside up to the calves. I watched for a little while as they finished, and then pushed themselves to stand. They looked like they were imitating trees or something, with their feet rooted in the ground. I heard movement in the distance and realized that Mrs. Harris hadn't been there. Thinking it was her making the noise, I ran. I just took off. I ran as hard and fast as I could. I tripped several times, but I kept making myself get up and run. When I got home, my entire body looked wrecked, and I sat in the shower for a while, trying to wash off the dirt and blood. And then you showed up. She completed her tale with a shrug. After a few long, silent moments, Isaac spoke up. "Can you take us back there?" Less than 2 hours later, equipped with bags full of water, protein bars, and whatever makeshift weapons we could gather, the 6 of us followed Caroline into the woods. The way she moved gave away how much pain she was in, and Samantha asked at one point if she was okay to do this. Caroline insisted she was, and I wondered if her own rage was fueling her. In the time we took to get prepared, she'd become hardened again, but this time in a determined way. She wanted to end this, and it was easy to see that. If I were her, I would have been fuming and frightened, but ready to do whatever it took to be done. We hiked through the trees for a long time. Hours passed as Caroline tried to remember the way. The sun began to lower in the sky, and I began to worry that we would either be too late or not be able to find them at all. As we stopped to rest for a moment, Caroline pulled something out of her backpack. It was the flute that I'd seen her play. "You still have it?" I asked her. She stared at it in her hand and nodded. "I have an idea," she said quietly. We gathered around her as she raised the flute to her mouth, closed her eyes, and began to play. It was slow, a soft melody similar to the very first one I'd heard. The air around us felt like it stopped moving entirely. As the tune picked up in pace, I felt again the sense of being in a peaceful meadow. I think all 6 of us were enraptured in the music. We didn't move, and it barely felt like I was breathing. Everything felt surreal, and I didn't realize I'd closed my eyes until I opened them. What greeted me was new and wondrous. The trees seemed to sparkle, the browns of the trunks a deeper shade tinged with softly pulsing veins. The leaves were brighter and richer shades of green than I had ever seen. The ground beneath my feet felt softer, but still sturdy. The blades of grass swayed in time with a song, shimmering as if they were speckled with the tiniest bits of water. As I looked around in awe, I saw that Romero, Isaac, Samantha, Carter, and Luke were doing the same. I knew that we were seeing the world in a new light somehow. When I looked back at Caroline, the musician, her skin was glowing gently with golden light. I wanted to reach out and touch her to see if she was as warm as the glow looked, but I resisted, feeling deep within myself that an action such as that would disrupt the entire scene, and I couldn't let that happen. "Do you hear that?" Luke asked. He was looking to our left, and I strained my eyes and ears in that direction. "Is that singing?" Isaac asked. "I think it is," Romero said. We all listened as the distant sound of voices joined the melody Caroline continued to play. There was a chorus growing from somewhere to our left, harmonizing with the flute. "Let's go," Luke said, and began to walk in the direction of the sound. I looked at Caroline, and she opened her eyes. She nodded without stopping the music. We left her to slowly trail behind us, playing on, and we rushed through the woods in search of the voices. It didn't take long for us to find the source. In a small area, not even big enough to be called a clearing, there were our missing partners. They all looked tired, dirty, and dazed. Their eyes were closed, and they swayed with the music. In a circle amongst the trees, they were planted just how Caroline had described, each leg buried in a hole in the dirt, up to their mid-calves. In the center was an angry Mrs. Harris. She glared at us as we approached, each of us rushing to our respective loved ones. "How dare you interrupt me?" she bellowed. Her voice was deeper than normal, almost echoing with multiple tones. As she ran to quarrel, Samantha purposefully barreled into the woman. I think she meant to knock her down, but misses. Harris, who now looked to be in her 40s, only staggered back a few steps. We each reached our significant others, but didn't know what to do next. Isaac started trying to dig around Morgan's feet. Romero was shaking Hannah and begging her to snap out of it. Samantha was hugging Coral and talking to her frantically. Luke was attempting to pull Michelle's legs out of the ground. Carter was grabbing Peter's hands and pleading with him to come along. And I was standing there in front of Lucy, facing Mrs. Harris. The woman's entire form seemed to darken. And she whistled. The creatures, or demons, or whatever they were that Caroline had told us about began to materialize, their shifting, oily forms melting up from the ground around Mrs. Harris. They struck before I was able to yell out a warning. Samantha was the first to go down, thrown against a tree. Her body fell to a heap at the base of the trunk. My eyes darted around, trying to figure out what I could do. Luke was the next to be attacked. A slithering appendage wrapped itself tightly around his neck. He tried to beat at it with his fists, but it gripped him tighter. His face turned red, and I could see he was struggling to breathe before it let go, and he was on his hands and knees, coughing and choking as he tried to catch his breath. I saw the mass of dark forms turn to go for Romero, and I yelled his name. He spun around and saw the shapes hurtling towards him. He was still no match for them. I didn't watch as he was incapacitated. Instead, I dropped to my knees and opened my backpack, searching for something that I could use as a weapon against these creatures. Isaac must have done the same thing, because when I looked back up, I saw him slashing at the darkness near him with an axe. It didn't do any good, though. The axe slowed when it hit the murky forms, but it didn't stop completely. They didn't even seem fazed by it. Carter gripped a sledgehammer in both hands. One of the creatures broke off and charged at him. I jumped in, leaving my backpack on the ground next to Lucy. First, I threw a handful of salt at the being headed for Carter, then pulled a lighter out of my pocket and aimed a can of hairspray. The air ignited as the large, shifting form shrank and screeched for being hit with the salt. It seemed to turn its attention to me and my homemade flamethrower. I saw Carter lunge forward and swing it with a sledgehammer, but it had the same effect as Isaac's axe. A tentacle-like limb shot out from the back of the creature and struck Carter, knocking him to the dirt. It continued heading towards me, seemingly unfazed by the fire. I let go of the can, and it dropped to the ground. I turned and grabbed the container of salt, opening the spout and swinging it around haphazardly, trying to make contact with a dark cloud thing. There was a slight sizzle, and it recoiled. It didn't stop, though. The salt seemed to hurt, sure, but it wasn't enough to halt anything. Another form joined the one now slowly approaching me. It almost seemed as if these things were calculating or thinking about what they wanted to do with me. Soft thuds sounded, and I let my eyes dart around to see that all of our loved ones had fallen to the ground. Their feet were still planted, but each of them seemed to be knocked out or asleep now in odd positions. The shapes stopped, possibly also surprised at this sudden change. "What are you doing?" "Get him," Mrs. Harris shouted. Her eyes were wild and enraged. If this were a cartoon or anime, I was sure I would have seen steam bellowing from her ears. My own eyes widened as I saw what was coming, though. In my periphery, I saw her shadowy minions begin to move again, but I was too invested in watching Caroline, who appeared from the trees. The instant I saw the flute plunge into Mrs. Harris's neck, I realized the music had stopped. All around me, I not only heard, but felt a deep rumbling. It was like the trees themselves were growling, clutching my head. I fell to my knees, unable to keep standing at the pressure I felt in my skull. Once more, to no one's surprise, I passed out. When I awoke, there was no sign of Mrs. Harris or her demonic friends. Caroline was in the center of the circle now. Blood spattered across her clothes. She lay there, and I was worried she was dead, but Samantha checked and announced she was still breathing. The rest of the night was spent fairly uneventfully. Everyone except Caroline came back to the land of the coherent. We helped each other to our feet, our loved ones out of the holes in the ground, and made our way back to our street. Romero and Carter took turns carrying Caroline as she remained passed out the entire way. I glanced around as we left, but I didn't see the flute anywhere. The next afternoon, everyone involved ended up back in our living room. We'd each contacted the police and conveyed the agreed-upon story. Mrs. Harris had kidnapped our 6 partners and drugged them. They couldn't remember anything. It wasn't a lie either. They really couldn't remember anything during that time. We filled them in on what had actually happened and theorized that Mrs. Harris was preparing for some sort of ritual with them, but hadn't gotten to it just yet, thankfully. We talked well into the night and shared a ton of delivered pizza. Around midnight, we broke off into small groups, then reconvened in Caroline's backyard. She had a large metal can that we all helped fill with every handcrafted organic wind chime we could find. Yes, that means that we snuck around the neighborhood and stole the accursed decorations off of porches. Once we piled them all into the trash can, Caroline added her woodworking tools and some gasoline. We each lit a match and dropped them in one by one. I don't know what happened to Mrs. Harris or the flute. It's kept me from sleeping through the night so far. None of us were willing to go back and look for either one, though. What I do know, however, is that not a single one of us will look at wind chimes the same again. And personally, I hope I never have to hear a single flute playing any song, whether it's a nice melody or not. Have you ever gotten lost in the sewers? The tunnels down there go on forever. They lead to horrifying places where monsters hunt people who don't follow the rules. I was a sewer worker assigned to the tunnels near the lake. The city where I worked had a vast network of sewer tunnels twisting and turning beneath the streets. They were all connected to the storm water line that controlled the flooding of the lake. All that water would be dumped into the ocean by the docks. Glenn and I were always the ones sent to deal with flooding. I had no complaints. Floodwaters were way better than toilet water. A recent downpour filled the tunnels with gunk and garbage, so we had to clear those blockages. Even if it was way past office hours, the lake might spill over and sink nearby towns if the flooding went unchecked. I gave up the game for this, Glenn complained. What? TV, dinner night? I asked. Glenn simply answered with an irritated grunt. He turned on the light attached to his helmet as we entered the sewers closest to the lake. If I had one complaint, it was the silence of the place. It was unnerving compared to the constant buzz of the city a couple of hours away. I followed him down the manhole entrance. Soon we were both wading through knee-deep water. Hey, it's your birthday or something, right? Glenn asked. Yeah, the big 2-0, so I guess I'm old now, I replied. Glenn laughed, the sound echoing through the pipes. If you're old, what makes me what? He asked. Mention. I replied. He chuckled and lit a cigarette. Glenn was like a mentor, or maybe an older brother, a much older brother. He taught me everything I knew when it came to cleaning pipes. He always told me he'd teach me how to smoke, but he never got around to it. It made him look cool, like a dead serious cop in some crime scene. I was afraid I'd only look like a wannabe. Where's your toolbox? Glenn asked as we neared the bend. About that. I might have left it at home. Yeah, I thought they'd give me the day off, I replied. Glenn sighed, but handed me his own. That's all right. Don't sweat it, kid. Mine's got everything we need. He exhaled smoke through his nose while he talked. I really wanted to learn that trick. Then a distant sound made us both stop. The near silence of the area made it seem louder. It was somewhere between a growl and a groan. Maybe a coyote got dragged in with a flood, I said. Glenn didn't answer. He stayed silent for a while, deep in his thoughts. I noticed that the hand holding his cigarette was shaking. Had you ever heard of a cow, Denton? Glenn asked. I knew who he was. Cal and his brother Chris worked sewer maintenance years before I did. One day, the Denton brothers went missing in the sewers. After days of searching, Cal Denton was the only one they found. He was covered in blood. The poor guy went insane and spoke one line over and over. It swallowed him. Everyone loved telling that story, especially to newbies. It was like a weird hazing that taught us never to go into the sewers alone. Some senior workers even shared pictures. It was enough to give you nightmares. I couldn't even imagine what could cause such profound fear on his face. Oh, come on, don't tell me you're scared of monsters too, I said. Can't be too careful, kid. This was their section, Glenn replied. I heard a lot of versions of that story. Some claimed Cal murdered his brother. Some said he was crazy to begin with. There was even a mention of alien abduction. Glenn was the only one who took the story seriously. The others couldn't keep a straight face. They joked that Chris was somewhere in Atlantic City, laughing at a prank he pulled on everybody. I was inclined to believe them, other than large rats and homeless people. I didn't think anything was remotely dangerous in the sewers. I wanted to ask more, but Glenn looked deep in thought. And so with Glenn's well-stocked toolbox, we headed further. The water was slowly rising because the city closed off the section until we were done. After the cleanup, it was also our job to manually open the pipes and let the floodwaters into the city sewers. We could let the city do it remotely, but we'd be swimming by the time we returned to the entrance. The deeper we went, the darker and damper it got. By then, the floodwaters were almost up to our waist. Glenn led the way, map in hand. We passed through sections, clearing blockages and debris along the way. I had a sack attached to my back that slowly filled up with gunk and garbage. You think Cal murdered his brother? I asked. No, those bozos didn't have the stomach for it, he said. You seem sure, I replied. Glenn stopped and folded the map before putting it in the toolbox. He took a long hit from his cigarette before he answered. They were my friends, he said. We worked in silence for a while. The only sounds were the occasional splashes of water. We were at the last stop of our cleanup tour when we heard the odd sound again. This time it sounded more like someone inhaling a big gulp of air. We both stopped and listened. I knew what rats sounded like. Even the biggest ones didn't sound like that. Then the sound grew louder. It was following us. And that was when we encountered a floating dead coyote. I was right. I figured the flooding trapped an entire pack of coyotes, and some of them had been following our smoky scent. I wanted to impress Glenn, so I took a wrench from his toolbox and started banging on the pipe wall. What are you doing? Are you stupid? Glenn said. I'm scaring the coyotes away. My old man did this at our farm, I replied. Glenn motioned for me to be quiet, and we listened for a moment. The sound was gone. Whatever it was, the noise drove it away. I smiled at Glenn and waved the wrench around. His expression was grave as he quieted me with an intense look. I never saw him that serious before. Sure, he looked like a cop who had seen enough evil in the world, but there was always a chuckle about the surface. It was different at that time, and it made me nervous. He carefully turned over the floating dead coyote. The lower half of its body was gone. It looked like it was taken in one big bite. Glenn, I asked. We need to get out of here, he said. He froze when he looked back at me. His eyes were fixed on something just over my shoulder. What the hell is that? He said. I heard shuffling behind me. It was quiet stalking. There was a faint smell of dead rats. And then I heard that big inhale of air, as if it was inches away. Before I could turn, something took hold of my arm and dragged me. It was all too fast. I couldn't understand what was happening. I lost my helmet light and everything went dark. I couldn't see the creature clearly as it pulled me away. It was strange. I could feel my body being dragged away, but I couldn't feel my arm. I just knew that half my left arm was inside the thing. I was not a lightweight. I was easily more than 200 pounds, and it surprised me that it jerked me around like a rag doll. I smacked it repeatedly with a wrench in my right hand, but it wouldn't let go of me. It had a weird gummy texture. The wrench just bounced right off of it. Suddenly, I was free of the creature's hold. Glenn was there, catching his breath as he helped me up. He placed my helmet on my head and clipped it in place. Always buckle your helmet, kid, he told me. I wanted to look at the creature, but Glenn pulled me away. No, let's go. I fed the coyote to it. Let's not be here for dessert, he said. We waded through the waist-deep water as fast as we could. Glenn had the map in the toolbox. I still held on to my wrench. My left arm was completely numb. My whole sleeve was soaked with goo, and it smelled like a dead rat. At some point, I noticed that the creature wasn't coming after us. It didn't matter. We still ran. A few minutes of running in water took a toll on our stamina. Adrenaline was the only thing keeping us moving. We reached one of the pipe gates leading to the city. Glenn and I climbed on a metal platform near the crank to manually open the gate. I took a closer look at my left arm. The feeling came back with pins and needles, but my arm felt weak. I could move it, but only a little. The pain became unbearable, and it made me stop. When Glenn saw me struggling, he took out the duct tape from the toolbox. Together, we made an improvised sling for my left arm. "What the hell was that thing, Glenn?" "I don't know," he replied. Glenn lit a cigarette and blew smoke through his nose. "You think that's what killed Chris?" I asked. "I don't know, kid," he said. Glenn flicked his half-consumed cigarette into the water and spat after a moment of silence. Glenn told me that he often visited Cal at the asylum. The stories were right. "He's insane then?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. "Well, Cal was convinced his brother was eaten by a monster. Any doctor would say he's insane. What would you say?" I replied, "Well, I'm no doctor, but I trust him. Now, maybe that's the monster. Maybe it's not. Whatever it is, we need to get the hell out of here." "Yeah, and get the army or something," I added. "You know, you watch way too many movies, kid," Glenn replied. He took out the map and a pencil from the toolbox. Glenn marked a spot on the map to show me where we were. Then he marked the exits. There were 2 of them. He crossed one out because it was already flooded. He was certain that the whole area would be submerged in water. The other exit wasn't easy either. We had to go back the way we came, meaning back to where the creature was, and Glenn was sure that the exit was locked. I pointed at the crossed-out exit. "Let's just open the floodgates so it wouldn't be flooded," I said. Glenn looked at me silently for a moment before he answered. "I don't want to face that thing, kid, but I don't want to let it loose into the city either." He was right. I wanted to kick myself in the nuts. The floodgate kept the creature trapped in that area. I had no idea which route to choose. It felt like either one would kill us. Glenn saw the worry on my face. He reached out and tapped my helmet to snap me out of it. "It's just a theory, but I think there's a way of hiding from this thing," he began. He opened his toolbox, took out a small parcel wrapped in newspapers, and handed it to me. "Well, happy birthday," he said. I opened the parcel. It was a pack of cigarettes and a lighter. Glenn lit a stick of cigarette from his pack in between puffs of smoke. He explained his theory to me. Cal Denton was a heavy smoker, he said. His brother was not. When the rescue team found Cal, he was huddled in a corner with cigarette butts all around him. "The creature attacked you, but it ignored me," he said. "For the next few minutes, Glenn taught me how to smoke. The trick with the nose was still too advanced for me, but I learned enough to avoid coughing my lungs out. We weren't sure if the creature could still see or hear us, so not coughing was important. While I was practicing smoking, Glenn memorized the path we were going to take. We had to leave our helmets and lights in case the creature could see us. That meant that we'd be walking in the water, blind. Glenn and I used duct tape to make a lure for the creature. We attached one end of the measuring tape to a screwdriver. The other end was taped to a pipe wall. Using the automatic coiling action of the tape measure, it would repeatedly bang the wall of the pipe. For good measure, we positioned the steel toolbox to fall over after the screwdriver made its final bang. I placed the sack of debris beside our lure and placed both of our helmets on it with the lights at max setting. We walked in the direction of the monster. We were in almost complete darkness, except for the embers of the cigarettes. The smoke had a calming effect on me, and it gradually slowed my breathing as we inched forward. The water level was above our waist by then. I was still holding onto the wrench while Glenn was armed with a foldable shovel. I imagined the nightmare Cal Denton survived. He was alone in complete darkness after he witnessed his brother's death. He got rescued, but people didn't believe him. I silently wished we could get out, ask for help, and maybe get proof that Cal was right all along. I was getting anxious. I felt like we'd been walking for longer than we planned. If the lure failed to trigger, Then we'd be walking straight towards the creature. Then it came. Loud, repeated banging sounded off in the distance. Glenn and I slowly submerged ourselves in the water so we'd be hidden. We huddled as close as we could to the wall. Nothing was happening. Seconds passed, and I was slowly losing air in my lungs. I was surprised at how much the cigarettes had already affected me. I wanted to surface, but I felt Glenn's hand pushing me down. His fingers bit into my shoulders when I struggled, and then, just like that, the creature scrambled past us, the water barely rippling. It was fast, and it filled the tunnel with the smell of dead rats. I almost gagged when we surfaced and took a big gulp of air. The lure worked, but it was far from over. I took a couple more nasty gulps of air before I followed Glenn along the wall. We had to hurry. The cigarettes were all soaked for being underwater, so this was our only chance. We reached the exit shaft with metal rungs we could climb. Then the banging stopped, and we heard the creature's groan echoing. I wasn't sure, but it sounded angry to me. I climbed first with Glenn supporting my weight. My left hand was still weak in the makeshift sling. I had to let go with my right hand. While Glenn pushed up so I could reach the next foothold, it was painfully slow, and we knew that the creature might return soon. We reached the top, but Glenn was right. The manhole cover was locked, and it was secured on the other side. With both our feet on a metal rung and our shoulders pressed against the cover, we tried pushing it. It wouldn't budge. If we banged on the steel cover, the creature would hear us. Minutes turned to an hour, and our muscles started getting tired. We were both freezing by that point. Glenn took out the remaining duct tape in his pocket and made harnesses for us. It wouldn't even matter for long. I could hear the water below us rising. Beyond the manhole cover, there were raindrops. The realization that we were moments away from drowning hit us. We took turns pushing on the cover, and soon a sliver of light came in. I worked on the double to get the cover off, but we could only manage a tiny space about a finger's width. Glenn inserted the shovel into it, and we pulled with all the strength we had left. But the cover still wouldn't budge, and we were running out of options. "Glenn," I asked. Yeah, Yella, you still got your ID kit?" he asked. As he took out his own from his breast pocket, I handed him mine, and he inserted both our IDs into the gap of the manhole cover. "It's so they know we were here," he said. With that, we both held the shovel and pulled with everything we had. The foldable shovel broke with a loud metallic snap. Glenn's duct tape harness couldn't take the sudden weight shift. He fell down the shaft with a loud clatter. I dismantled my harness and climbed down. The rising water level was enough to break his fall, but it was easily 20 feet. Heights like that can make hitting the water very painful. I made it down to the water level. Glenn was there, hanging onto a rung. He was wincing in pain. "Glenn, you okay?" I whispered. "There's no need to whisper, kid. With that racket, the thing's already coming." Glenn told me that we had to swim. He knew it'd be difficult, but he believed we could make it to the other exit. He took off my duct tape sling and tied one end to my arm and the other to his. We took a few gulps of air and we dove down. It was complete darkness, but I just followed the tape on my arm and I swam. We were making progress, and then the tape became slack. I felt around under the water, and I found the other end of the tape was cut. I wasn't connected to Glenn anymore. I couldn't feel him anymore, but I knew a larger presence was in that water with me, and it moved faster than my one arm to swimming. I was starting to run out of air, so I swam to the top of the water. Fortunately, there was a few inches of space beneath the ceiling of the pipe. I took a large gulp of air before the water rose again. I swam blindly. When my hand touched a wall, I followed it and hoped that it would lead to the exit. It felt like forever, and I knew I was going to drown soon. And then I saw a light. It renewed my energy. The exit was just there. I told myself I was going to make it, and I did. It turned out to be one of the helmets we left at the lure we made. The strap was caught on the crank to open the floodgate. The beam of the helmet light caught movement a few feet away. It was large and fast enough to send ripples my way. I swam to the top of the water again. Thankfully, that section still had a few inches of air. I needed to look for Glenn. It took me a few times to dive down and come up for air, but I couldn't find him. I came up again, and my lips were touching the top of the tunnel. I knew it would be my last try. I swam around, but there was no sign of him. I was getting desperate. I fought the urge to inhale. I looked at the helmet light caught on the floodgate crank. There was no other way. I had to open the floodgate. My right arm took hold of the crank, and I started pulling. It was stuck. Even with my feet braced on the wall, the crank wouldn't turn. And then I felt something on my arm. It was Glenn pulling on the crank with me. He grabbed it with both hands, and it started to turn. The floodgate beside us rose slowly and started sucking in water. We used the crank to keep us from being carried by the current. Glenn was pointing at something just beyond the light. I couldn't see it clearly. It was big and swimming just enough to keep itself from being sucked in. My vision was starting to blur. I ran out of air, and my lungs were starting to fill with water with a remainder of my strength. I handed the wrench to Glenn, and then I lost consciousness. I woke up to Glenn pumping my chest. I vomited water to the side and took in a lungful of air. "We're alive, kid," Glenn said. We sat for a moment on that metal platform. The sound of the water flowing into the floodgate was like a rushing river. "I need a smoke," I said. Glenn chuckled and helped me up. "Kid, you've been a smoker for about 30 minutes, he said. "Yeah, but I'm getting good at it," I replied. "Come on, I'll buy you a pack," he said. We made it out of the sewers and back to the city. Glenn immediately reported the incident to our superiors. Well, after we had a cigarette, they believed Glenn. The police were notified, and a large-scale animal hunt was conducted to check every inch of the city sewers. I was sent to the hospital. The state of my arm baffled the doctors. The half of my arm that was inside the creature lost muscle mass in a matter of hours. The doctors had no other way to put it. They simply told me that my arm was dying. They had to cut it off, or it might poison my blood or something. Well, they did cut it off, and I donated my dead arm so they could study how the creature fed. It was one of their most valuable specimens, especially with the smelly goo on it. Despite the policemen and canine units, they never found the creature in the sewers. Instead, they found a few dead homeless people with loss of muscle mass and countless dead rats. It was enough proof that the creature was real. The sewer system was no longer accessible to the public. It was mandated that sewer workers would only enter the sewers in groups of 5, and at least one of them would be an armed policeman. I spent 2 months in the hospital after my surgery. Glenn would visit me almost daily and would tell stories about the sewers. A lot of weird things had started happening since we let the creature in. I wasn't even sure if they were all connected or if the sewers had always been a strange place, and I just hadn't noticed. Glenn heard about what happened to a homeless man. He lived behind a Chinese restaurant. He had free food from leftovers and a warm wall from a kitchen that was constantly cooking. It was a prime spot for a homeless man, but he had competition with the rats one day. The homeless man trapped and killed a rat. It was a terrible mistake. Rats came flooding out of the gutters and every hole in that alley. There were giant cat-sized ones, small ones with long tails, and every size in between. The screeching from hundreds of rats was deafening. The kitchen staff looked out their kitchen window and saw the rats gang up and overwhelm the homeless man. After that, the rats carried him down to the sewers, alive and screaming. The kitchen staff could see the nail marks from the man as he tried to hold on to the edge of the rain gutter. In the end, his fingers got tired and his screams echoed as he was brought deeper underground. "I'm never eating Chinese again," I said. "How about General Tso's chicken?" Glenn replied, "Well, that is pretty good." "All right, I'll think about it," I said. Glenn continued his story. Days later, a search and rescue team saw this homeless man in the sewers shouting for help as a carpet of rats carried him around. They never found him, but sometimes they can still hear his screams. Mixed in with the sound of rats, he moved on to his next story with a more serious face. There was one time when Glenn tagged along with a group of policemen in search of a missing elderly woman. Her neighbors told them that this woman named Esther had dementia. She would get confused at times. Mostly she'd remember her younger days and wander into places that she remembered. She entered a bank that used to be a restaurant and demanded to see the menu. Things like that. One day, she wandered into the sewers, and her neighbors reported it right away. Glenn and the policeman went in search of her. They started hearing music, the kind that was even too old for Glenn to recognize. And then they saw blankets of dead cockroaches just floating by. Okay, now that is creepy, I said, interrupting his story. It gets worse, kid. Glenn and the policeman turned left at the bend of pipes and saw the old woman at the end of a tunnel. She was dancing with a man that had a goat for a head. The music suddenly stopped, and they both turned to look at them. The next thing they knew, they were outside the sewers. That exact same thing happened several more times. They'd see the dead roaches floating by, hear the music, and then turn left to watch Esther and the goat man dancing. Every time the music stopped, they'd be back to where they started. In the end, they couldn't rescue the old woman, the official statement. Esther was never found, but an unofficial rule spread amongst everyone going down there. If you hear music and see dead roaches, don't turn left. Despite the strange encounter, some search and rescue people used this area whenever they were in a hurry. They named it Esther's Exit. You got to let me try that, I said. I don't know. It feels strange. I don't recommend it, kid, Glenn replied. Glenn told me that some of those who tried Esther's Exit had bloody noses or lost a tooth, and one unlucky guy even slipped into a coma. Speaking of unlucky, Glenn heard about an incident where a fellow sewer worker was called in to look at a hotel basement. It was right at the edge of old downtown, and that old hotel that had been built there before Nixon was president. It had gone through multiple renovations, but one element remained the same. There were no windows. People were always curious how it could stay in business if they didn't see anyone going in and out of its lobby doors. They had workers going in and out, but when they were asked about the hotel, they couldn't answer. The box, people called it. They never knew what the hotel's name was. The sewer worker, named Frank, received a call from someone inside the building. Apparently, the old hotel had a vault door that led to the sewer system underneath. That was all they told Frank. I remembered Frank. Glenn told me he was one of the sewer workers who didn't believe Cal's story. Frank had always been curious about the old sewer system back in the day, before the modern pipes. There was just something authentic about hand-carved tunnels out of solid stone, and that hotel had a direct access to it. Frank was glad to accept the job. He drove to the old downtown and was welcomed by a woman inside the hotel lobby. There were no lights inside apart from the square of sunlight coming from the lobby doors. The woman was standing just at the edge of that light. She smiled at Frank and led him to the basement. Frank had to turn on his helmet light just to navigate through the halls. The woman leading him walked very fast. When they arrived at the basement vault door, he was already panting. The woman easily opened the old vault door. Despite its age, the door was properly maintained and oiled. The familiar smell of the sewers welcomed him, but there was a foreign scent mixed in beyond the vault door. The sewers were flooded. The woman told him that Frank had to deal with the flooding, so hotel guests could come in. This gave Frank pause. What kind of hotel received guests from the sewers? Well, Frank went to work on the old sewer section. He quickly found the source of the water blockage and probably that strange smell. It was a huge clump of meat. There was no other way to put it. It was probably some butcher's fault who accidentally dumped the whole slab of beef into the sewers. He pulled it out of the drain, and the water flowed again. That was when he got a full look at the meat he was holding. It had a human arm attached to it. Frank dropped it and was about to run back to the vault door when he saw people there lining up to enter. He stood frozen in place. Each of the guests going into the vault doors had porcelain skin and dark eyes. He waited until everyone had gone in before he went closer. The woman was there. She led Frank to the lobby and told them that they would request for him by name any time they had a problem with the sewers. Well, Frank resigned that day. That was when he told Glenn all about it, thinking it was somehow connected to the creature Glenn encountered. Frank was never the same since he never went out to drink at night anymore, and he would only walk in direct sunlight. Okay, wait, you don't mean. Frank went insane. Glenn interrupted. No, not that. Those are vampires, right? I said. I'm not sure, kid, but it's ironic that nobody believed in Frank's story, Glenn said. Before he went home, he had one last sewer story for me. The old man and a couple of other sewer workers were called in. The news about Frank was still fresh then. Despite the new gossip, all talk died down when they made it to location. They just stood there and stared. Glenn and his fellow sewer workers were brought into the public pool. Despite not being told what the job was, they had a clue what it was before they could even enter the pool area. Bubbles, I asked. That's right. Bubbles, kid, whole lot of it, Glenn said. They were standing across the street from the public pool, and the whole thing was covered in white bubbles. It had also overflowed and taken over half the street. The police had the area taped, and beat cops were directing traffic away from it as Glenn and the others were approaching. There were people who'd emerged from the bubble fortress. They looked shaken and were coughing up bubbles. Several ambulances were dispatched to the area, and children were brought to the hospital. Everything was covered in bubbles. A man met them near the entrance and said that they had everything out of the area except for one person. They couldn't find him. His name was Josh Mackin, an obese man in his early 30s. He was last seen going into the showers. We went in blind. Good thing I got that place memorized like the back of my hand, Glenn said. You go to the public pool? I asked. I'm allowed to have a social life, he replied. Their only difficulty was that the bubbles were suffocating. They only made it past the entryway. Glenn's fellow sewer workers couldn't take it. One was even having a panic attack. The poor guy had a bad case of claustrophobia. Those bubbles closed in on them. Glenn continued his story. He closed his eyes and continued walking through the bubbles. The showers were on the lower floor, so he took the stairs slowly. Soon he felt the familiar heat from the steam room and heard the sounds of running shower heads. Those were probably abandoned when the bubbles came. Then he heard a sound. It was like someone with long nails tapping on the tiled floor. Every step Glenn took, he'd hear that strange sound scuttling around him. He called out for Josh, but there was no answer. He pressed forward into the sound of the running showers and called again. And that was when a voice answered him. It sounded inhuman. The voice told him that Josh was there. When Glenn asked where, it simply answered that Josh was everywhere. All right, who are you? Glenn called out. It took a moment, but the inhuman voice answered. It told him that Josh summoned it from the sewers. He wanted to lose weight, the voice said. Glenn was slowly moving forward as he talked to the voice. He was trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. He slowly pulled out his wrench, ready for anything. What did you do? Glenn asked. The voice simply said that bubbles were weightless. Glenn got to the final shower stall. The curtain was drawn and the water was running. He swiped away the bubbles to give him space to see. He pulled on the shower curtain and rushed inside. There was a small hole on the floor. It wasn't big enough to fit a grown man, but it was big enough for the red and orange crab that was taking a peek at him with human eyes on its shell. It managed to run away. Before Glenn could bring down his wrench on it. What happened to Josh? I asked. Well, we never saw him. Took 2 days to clear all those bubbles, Glenn replied. Well, that story was nuts. Thanks. I am definitely having bubble-related nightmares tonight. I didn't even know that was a thing. Glenn chuckled and offered me a stick of cigarettes. We smoked until a nurse came and shooed him out of the room. That night, I had dreams of creatures and talking bubbles. When I was well enough, I went with Glenn to visit Cal Denton at the asylum. He wanted to be the first one to give him the good news. Cal was deemed innocent for the murder of his brother Chris. He still had PTSD and mental problems from the nightmare he went through. But at least he wasn't a criminal anymore. The Cal wasn't exactly well enough to be back in society, but he started to mend on that day. I had to go back to the hospital. My arm stump was still healing. While I was there, I encountered a boy waiting for surgery. He was A. His leg had died the same way my arm did. The boy told me that there was a hole in the sidewalk and he fell. The sewage current carried him far into the tunnels. It was dark, so he couldn't see what was happening. He didn't even notice that he was swimming with a creature. The boy thought he was going to die. His leg felt very weird. It went numb, he said, and then he heard a dog barking and someone pulled him out of the water. The dog grabbed him by the collar of his shirt, and an old man carried him away. It was Glenn. After that, the boy passed out. He woke up to the dog licking his face. It was a large black and gray German shepherd, he said. The boy told me that he saw his collar. The dog's name was Old Sarge. The dog stayed with him, only leaving just when Glenn came back with the ambulance. The boy wanted to thank the dog and the old man personally, but he was about to go into surgery. I told him I would thank them for him. I watched the nurses wheel him into the operating room, and the pain of my stump flared. It was a reminder of my mistake. The boy lost his leg because of the creature. After that, I looked for the canine units to thank Old Sarge. It was the least I could do for the boy. But it was the weirdest thing. Every canine officer told me the same thing. There wasn't any police dog named Old Sarge. You know, it somehow gave me comfort that maybe this dog was out there protecting people. I had a feeling that we were going to need all the help we could get. I even asked Glenn about Old Sarge. He knew him. He said the dog led him to the missing boy. You know, at first I thought he was a canine unit, but he's just showed up and helped me 4 times now, Glenn said. Seriously, I asked. Yeah, you know, the mayor even declared us honorary search and rescue officers of the sewers, Glenn said proudly. I felt bad that Glenn went back to working the sewers immediately, while I healed and focused on my prosthetic arm. He felt guilty because we chose to open the floodgate. We unleashed this thing into the city. I felt the same. Glenn's morality had bled into me, so I couldn't wait to go back and make up for what I'd done. A couple of days later, I met Glenn at a local bar. Over beer and cigarettes, he told me about his mission the previous day. It was a bad day, kid, he said. His body was still sore from multiple trips into the sewer, but he volunteered to join. There was a 10-year-old girl trapped in the sewers. Despite having a policeman guarding the manhole entrance, the girl wandered in and had been missing for 5 hours. A neighbor saw her and reported it. Glenn went in with a team of 4 policemen and a canine unit. They got in, and the dog caught the girl's scent. I'm not sure, kid, but I think this would be the last time a canine unit would be used in the sewers, he told me. I drank my beer and kept silent as he continued. Glenn and his team followed the dog. They kept following the scent and took them through turns and tunnels, and then they noticed they'd circle back to where they came from. Glenn knew something was wrong when the dog kept leading them to the manhole exit. The handler tried to control the dog, but it wouldn't go back into the tunnels anymore. I think that dog was trying to lead us away from danger, Glenn said. I told him that we had dogs at my old man's farm. They protect everyone by instinct if they sense something like wolves or even a coming storm. Glenn then told me that the canine unit tried to stop them from going back into the tunnels. It even bit a couple of unlucky cops. You think it had to do with the creature? I asked. I bet my liver on it, Glenn replied. That ain't much of a bet, I said. Glenn chuckled into his beer. Still got a couple of decades on it, maybe. We fell into silence as we looked around the bar. It was full of people oblivious to the danger right beneath them. What happened to that canine unit reminded me of Old Sarge and how he saved that boy. I was still getting used to my new arm, so Glenn offered to light my cigarette. So what happened next? I asked. Glenn continued his story. He told me that it took 3 policemen to pin the dog down. After that, they continued to search without it, but never found the girl. There was a sadness in his voice. So Old Sarge didn't show? No, maybe he was busy somewhere, Glenn replied. After that night at the bar, I didn't see Glenn for 3 days. Fellow sewer workers told me that he went into the sewers and they hadn't seen him since. I didn't even think about it. I went after him. It was a foggy Sunday morning, and I was a few feet away from a manhole cover behind an industrial complex. It was unguarded. With a final shaky breath, I stepped forward. Are you going somewhere, kid? Glenn asked. And there it was, just sitting with his back against the building wall. The policeman in charge of guarding that area had wrapped him in a blanket and was talking on his radio. Glenn looked like he'd gone through hell, and a few tears were threatening to fall from his eyes. He puffed on his cigarette and shivered in that blanket. An ambulance arrived minutes later. and that was when Glenn parted the blanket. He had a soggy and dirty rag doll in his other hand. He saw me looking and handed the doll to me as if it was a real girl. Why? I was too late, kid. Before the ambulance could take him to the hospital, Glenn insisted that we return the doll to the family of the little girl. They were somewhere in the area. I held Glenn up so he could stand and hand the doll to the crying mother. "I'm so sorry," he told her. I knew he wanted to say more, but I could see that he was struggling with words. He kept trying to start something, but would drift back into silence, unsure of what to say. Somehow, though, the mother understood everything. She nodded, hugged the doll, and walked away. At that moment, I felt like the weight of what we'd done was much heavier now. I rode in the ambulance with Glenn, and that was when he told me everything that had happened. The day after our talk at the bar, he decided to go back and search for the girl. Our bosses did not okay that rescue mission, and Glenn didn't even bother to ask for help from the police. It was mainly because the cops reported the girl dead, despite the lack of evidence. "They just hold me back anyway," Glenn said. He placed a cigarette on his lips. Despite his attempt at lightening the mood, it was barely enough to mask his mix of anger and sadness. The medic inside the ambulance told us that we were not allowed to smoke. Glenn just stared at him. I also gave him the meanest face I could manage while I ignited Glenn's cigarette for him. The poor medic just looked at us and then bandaged Glenn's sprained ankle. "You think the monster had reached this far into the sewers?" I asked. Glenn silently puffed on his cigarette and then answered, "I don't just think. I know the creature's here, kid." I scratched a spot under my prosthetic arm while I chewed on what Glenn told me. "You're sure?" I asked. "If I bet my liver on it, would you believe me?" Glenn replied, "You know, you're weirdly proud of your liver." "Okay, fine, I believe you." "Tell me what happened," I said. He went through the route of the canine dog, even though it wouldn't help them in the end. The dog did initially get the girl's scent. Glenn took it slow and checked every inch of those tunnels. "I ran into the creature," Glenn said. "I heard it breathing around one corner." The medic gulped. He was also listening. Glenn said he hid in a dark corner. He turned off his helmet light and puffed smoke to hide his presence. "I wish I could see in the dark, kid. That thing passed right in front of me." I felt scared just thinking about it. My encounter with that thing was still too fresh in my head. When he felt the monster was gone, he turned his light back on. Glenn headed in the direction where the creature emerged. It turned out to be a hidden corner with a large crack. The hole looked old, with edges that looked eroded. And then Glenn asked me if I've ever been to a cave, and I nodded. "There was a cave near my old man's farm." Then you must be familiar with cave walls. "Smooth and eroded slowly by water over decades," Glenn said. I nodded. I had a feeling where he was going with it. Glenn told me that it was an impossible cave. He described it just how I remembered such caves. Forget decades. An extensive cave system like that would take centuries, and when they first searched for the girl, that cave wasn't there. "You think the creature made it?" I asked. "I don't know, kid, but it sure smelled like it," Glenn replied. Glenn wasn't planning on exploring the cave, but he heard a dog's whimper echoing from inside. He followed his instincts and went right in. Parts of the walls were coated with goo. Glenn had to turn off his light in case the creature came back, so he went in blindly. He followed the sound of whimpering in the dark. When he was getting close, he took a chance and turned on his light. Old Sarge was there. He was crying near an underground river. German shepherds cry. I interrupted. "I don't know, but he was definitely upset." Glenn began. He wasn't injured. When he saw me, Old Sarge dropped the girl's doll right in front of me. "You think he tried to save the girl?" I asked. Glenn nodded. He continued his story. He placed the doll inside his overalls, leaving his hands free. He tried to escape the way he came in, but Glenn heard the creature's gulp of air inside the cave tunnel. It was coming towards him. I probably wasn't thinking clearly at the time. I just knew I had to get out of there, Glenn said. To buy some time, Glenn took out his wrench and screwdriver. He threw them into the two tunnels. The creatures scrambled towards the sounds. He hoped it was enough to give him time to escape. He followed old Sarge into the river. That would explain why Glenn and the doll were soaking wet. I knew he'd take me back to safety, Glenn said. They swam in the underground river for a while before they made it to one of the creature's tunnels. It took us more than a day to avoid the thing in those tunnels. In the end, old Sarge got me out, Glenn said. We were silent for a while. Glenn, the medic. We all smoked our cigarettes. Then we arrived at the hospital, and I watched them wheel Glenn in. He was already unconscious from exhaustion. The doctors assured me he'd be just fine. I wanted to ask him why he didn't take me with him. I looked at my prosthetic arm and thought about what Glenn said earlier about the cops. They'd hold him back. It was a joke, but it hit me harder than I thought. I needed to be less of a liability to him. Parents went on protest, asking the mayor for justice. He responded by dedicating a park bench in honor of the missing girl. The day after Glenn was admitted to the hospital, I got called in for a sewer job. I came in expecting it was going to be cleanup duty. Since Glenn was out of commission, I figured I wouldn't be given any special assignments. I was wrong. I made my way to HQ. It was a simple enough government building, a large concrete box with doors and windows surrounded by a parking lot. I was greeted at the gate by an old security guard. There were police cars in the parking lot, and a few cops were standing around drinking coffee. One cop stood in front of me and sized me up with his eyes from top to bottom. I didn't know if he was frowning at me or if it was the natural state of his face. The cop told me to follow him, and he walked off without checking if I'd follow. I was brought into a conference room. There were 5 people around a large wooden table. I recognized 2 of them from sewer maintenance. The police chief was there and a couple of reps from City Hall. Despite the presence of the chief, the meeting was dominated by the coat and tie people. They call the shots because they represent the mayor. Everything should be done properly. The mayor was under a lot of pressure, and the election was months away. After the meetings, I found myself riding in a police car with 3 cops. We were heading for the asylum. That day, a sinkhole opened in the basement of the asylum. It caused the collapse of the whole West Wing. While the rest of the patients were being evacuated, my mission was to go with the cops into the sinkhole, determine the cause of it, and if possible, rescue the missing patients who fell into the sewers, and we had to do all of it before the whole area collapsed. Booker was the sergeant in charge. He was the man who measured me with his eyes earlier. I didn't know what his problem was. To pass the time, I opened the toolbox. I had a roll of duct tape, a wrench, a screwdriver, and a tape measure. The second layer was full of cigarette packs and extra lighters. I wanted to bring more, but it would be too heavy for my prosthetic arm. The 2 other cops were M. Diaz and F. Pelton, based on the name tags of their uniforms. They never talked to me. I can only guess that Booker told them not to. It was already dark when we got out of the police car and entered the asylum. The electric supply of the building was down. I turned on the flashlight of my helmet while the cops had lights on their rifles. The asylum was a large brick building. I wasn't an expert, but I knew the building was older than Glenn. I made a mental note to tell him that joke the next time I saw him. There was an archway that led to the collapsed West Wing. Diaz and Pelton were ordered to secure the area. I took this time to light a cigarette for myself, and I offered one to Booker. He flat out refused. "You'll need it." "Just take one," I said. He looked at me and the cigarette I was offering him, but he didn't take it. After that, Diaz and Pelton came back and told us the area was secure. "Excuse me," I said. We were about to enter the West Wing. They stopped and looked at me. I almost folded from their collective stares, but I took a deep breath and thought of how Glenn would handle the situation. "So, a sewer worker has no business telling you guys what to do. I know that. But for the love of God, if you want to survive down there, light a cigarette," I said. Diaz and Pelton looked to their sergeant for guidance. The rule about smoking was a little hard to believe at first. Booker looked at me with a serious expression. I was offering them my pack. Then he sighed and folded. So, they all had a lit cigarette in between their lips. I also insisted on giving them each a pack and a lighter in case we got separated. We were careful as we slowly walked through the rubble of the collapsed area. The sinkhole was just ahead, and it was difficult to see anything. Our lights were blocked by the thick dust and air. The silence was disturbed by the scream of a woman. It sounded close. We sprinted forward in time to see a nurse dragged into the large sinkhole. Her screams were cut off. When we got to the edge of it, there was no sign of her or the creature. The cops checked every inch of the area and made their rounds along the edges, pointing their rifles and lights in every section. We were in the middle of what appeared to be a function hall. There was a stage with a podium at the far end, and there were foldable chairs on the floor. About half the hall was dominated by a sinkhole. Diaz and Pelton looked shaken. Booker was silent. It was their first encounter with the Fong, so I knew how they felt. The image of Glenn in my head was very much alive when I called out to them and made my way into the sinkhole. "All right, come on, boys. We got a job to do," I said. I felt kind of good when I heard him march behind me. When Booker took the lead, he gave me a silent nod of approval and readied his rifle. We slowly made our way down an incline, passing through rubble and pipes. Soon we were walking through ankle-deep muck. The three of them did a good job at breathing through their mouths. Floodwaters really were better than toilet water, despite the smell. Diaz crouched down and examined the walls of the sinkhole. He cleared away some of the rubble and showed us what he found. I saw layers of concrete, dirt, and stone. Then Diaz pointed out the space for the sewers and the many tunnels underneath that caused the collapse. I touched the tunnel walls. Glenn was right. They were cave tunnels, and the surface felt like they were slowly eroded by water for a long time. It seemed old, but those tunnels were recently dug by the creature. I bet Glenn's liver on it. The walls were starting to come down in several places, and the floor was shaking every few minutes. The whole place was ready to sink into the sewers. We heard another scream in the distance. It echoed through the pipes. Each of them pointed their rifle to a different section. The sound came from everywhere. After a moment, Booker made a decision. He ordered Diaz and Pelton to take a tunnel each. He wanted to save as many as we could before the building caved in. There were 4 entrances in that sinkhole. Despite Booker's protests, I chose to go into a tunnel alone ahead of tagging along with one of them. I needed to be less of a liability. Look, if we miss one tunnel, that could mean a life we fail to save. I said Booker gave me his approval before he took the tunnel behind him. Pelton approached me and handed me a pistol. He gave me a simple salute before he took the tunnel next to mine. I slowly waded through the muck. It was one of the creature's cave tunnels, so it wasn't just the toilet water. There were also hints of the creature's dead rat scent that brought me back with a gun, a toolbox, and the cigarette. I was one hand short, so I took out my duct tape and taped my tools on my arms and legs for easy access. I had to leave my empty toolbox behind. I heard gunshots in the distance. Automatic rifle. It continued firing for close to 10 seconds before everything went silent again. I wanted to turn back and help, but I heard someone calling out. At that moment, I made a choice. I chose the one calling for help. Rather than the one who could defend themselves, my tunnel curved downward into a sheer drop. I slipped on the smelly goo and almost fell. It was a good thing I reached to steady myself. That's how I discovered the branch tunnel by accident. It was too small to walk through. I had to crawl. It was difficult with only one working hand, and there was loose rubble everywhere. The small ones would bite into my palm and elbow. There were even large ones that I had to push to one side so I could pass through. And then I heard something that sounded like someone taking in a big gulp of air. It was somewhere behind me, and it was catching up. I turned off the light of my helmet, and I crawled as fast as I could. When I felt it catching up to me, I pulled out Pelton's gun and pointed. I braced myself for the loud bang, but nothing happened. I forgot the dam's safety. I crawled away, scrambling faster to make up for lost time. Small rubble bit into my skin, but I kept going. The creature was almost on me, and I couldn't see an end to the tunnel. Then I came across a large concrete block, and I squeezed through it. I made it in time, feeling the creature push on it and me along with it. I put my full weight on it, but it wasn't working. I needed to buy myself time. I took my wrench and screwdriver. They were both taped on my forearm. I held one in each hand and forced them to the sides. I heard a groan on the other side, and I didn't wait around. I got the hell out of there. I made it out of the tunnel and into the sewers, and that's when I heard the voice calling out again. The words were clear. "Help me," the voice said. There was a figure huddled in that far corner. It was one of the patients of the asylum. I recognized the hospital gown. I moved closer, and the strong smell of cigarette smoke welcomed me. The voice called out again, asking for help and a cigarette. I recognized the voice and shone my light on his face. It was Cal Denton, and he was surrounded by cigarette butts. I can only imagine that it was the same scene the rescuers saw when they found him. We locked eyes, and he immediately reached over and turned off the light of my helmet. "Keep that light off," he began. "If you want to live, you get on the ground and you light a cigarette." In a matter of moments, we were both smoking as if our lives depended on it. We were in the dark with just our puffing. And then we heard the creature. It felt so close that I could almost reach out and touch it. I remembered Pelton's gun. I took it out of my pocket, flicked the safety off, and pointed it where I thought the monster was. Then Cal's hand pushed it down. We sat there in silence for a while, and then Cal let out a sigh of relief. "It's gone," he whispered. "Why'd you stop me?" I asked. "I saw a guard shoot it earlier." "It didn't do shit," he said. He then told me that he spent days in the dark and learned how to survive. I looked over at him. "This is our fault, you know. Glenn and I opened the floodgate, and now it's here," I said. Cal told me that Glenn had told him. His voice softened. Before he said it wasn't our fault. And then, out of nowhere, he began to cry. It swallowed him. It swallowed him. It swallowed him. It swallowed him. He said that over and over. It gave me pause just thinking about his story. I wanted to ask him more about the creature and the things he saw in the dark, but Cal was not ready to talk about any of it. His mind was still healing. After a while, he settled back down. He lit the cigarette I handed him earlier. All of a sudden, Cal was back to normal. There was a strength in his voice when he told me we had to get out of there. We made our way through the sewers. Cal insisted that I keep my light off. He led the way in the dark, with me holding on to his shoulder. In the distance, we heard someone screaming. There were gunshots, and it was over quickly. The sewers were silent again, but Cal was frozen in place. "You okay, Cal?" I asked. "It swallowed him," he said again. I know, but we have to keep going," I replied. But my words weren't helping. He just kept repeating that. Cal looked over at me with this crazy look in his eyes. He grabbed me by the shoulders, and then he was gone. He ran off somewhere. I went back to our spot earlier, but he wasn't there. I checked the creature's tunnel, but there were no whispers. This guy was kind of a pain in the ass, but I knew I wouldn't forgive myself if I just left him to die down there. I didn't need to ask myself what Glenn would do. He was his friend. I knew that Glenn would just casually light a smoke and say some cool one-liner before he headed back into the tunnels to find Cal. With a deep sigh, I headed deeper into the sewers. All the while I was wondering why I forgot to bring a map. Glenn always had the map. I was always depending on him too much. I needed to be less of a burden to him. I heard the creatures groan somewhere ahead. I turned off my light quickly and puffed my cigarette. I quickly inched my way closer to the wall, and I made myself as small as possible. The creature was somewhere close. The smell of dead rats was mingling with the cigarette smoke, and then a hand covered my mouth. I struggled, but the hand was surprisingly strong. It smelled of cigarettes. "You be quiet now. It's coming straight for you," Cal said, and then he told me to run. We passed through the tunnel as quietly as we could. I tripped a couple times, but Cal helped me, and then I saw a light at the end. There was that groan and the intake of air behind me, and all of a sudden the end of the tunnel fell so far. I knew that the creature would be on us if I didn't do anything. I took my last pack of cigarettes, and I lit them all at the same time. I almost felt dizzy from inhaling that much smoke, but Cal was there to keep me running straight. I dropped my improvised smoke bomb behind me, and I pushed my legs to move faster, and it worked. The creature stopped before the wall of smoke. Cal and I made it to the cave exit. It was the courtyard just outside the west wing of the asylum. Just when I thought the danger was over, I saw Booker running. He told us that the whole area was about to collapse. We ran like hell. Walls began to crumble and sink into the ground. Everything was getting sucked into a large hole. But we ran and we made it. We stopped just beyond the outer gates. The rest of the patients and asylum staff were there. They were ushered by Diaz into public buses that would take them to their facilities. Booker, Cal, and I were leaning on the outer gate. We were looking into the large sinkhole that ate the whole asylum complex, including the grounds. A nurse came to collect Cal, but before he went, he looked back at me with a grin on his face. "Now you give my regards to Glenn." "Okay," he said. "I will do that," I replied. Before he went, he asked for my name, but I told him that Glenn called me Kid. He smiled. "Well, I'll see you around, Kid." He whistled as he walked away. I watched as he was ushered into a bus. After everyone was safely transported, police officers came in to secure the large sinkhole. I just hung around mainly because I didn't know what to do. And then Booker and Diaz approached me. Booker gave me a note with numbers of how many personnel and patients they saved that day. "It was for my report at HQ," he said. "Thank you," I replied. Booker and Diaz looked uncomfortable. Diaz looked down like he was trying to read something on the ground. "Where's Pelton?" I asked. Booker's face softened. His frown turned into a blank stare. That was when he told me that Pelton was dead. Booker told me that Pelton sacrificed his life so Diaz could lead the staff to safety. We were silent for a moment after that. I only met the 3 cops that day, but I knew that they were good men. I did my report at HQ, and the note Booker gave me did help. Even though I could only save one person, they saw the whole thing as a team success. The whole asylum complex collapsed on top of the creature, but nobody assumed it died there. Stone and concrete seemed to be nothing to it. I'd seen the creature melt stone down there, and that was considered very helpful in understanding it. Authorities speculated on the creature's origin based on recent findings and reports. Some said that prairie dogs easily dug through concrete. They considered this for a while, but the creature didn't exactly dig. It melted the stone. A biologist suggested that the creature had to be some sort of reptile. There were species of lizards and snakes that could produce acidic saliva. The creature could produce something corrosive enough to melt stone. It was highly possible. And for a time, the creature was considered a reptile, especially with its hard exterior. When I hammered it with a wrench, it just bounced off. And then Dr. Charlotte Nix came up with a theory that terrified everyone. A new species of bees had been discovered in a Utah national park, the Pueblo bees. They were named after ancient people who built their dwellings on cave entrances and cliff faces. These bees made their nest inside solid stone, creating a network of tunnels. It still wasn't confirmed, but Dr. Nix was positive that the creature's tunnels under the city would resemble those made by the Pueblo bee queen. What terrified everyone was the implication of this theory. If the creature was related to bees and was indeed a queen, it could start birthing a colony that could easily overwhelm the whole city. "Okay, honestly, I don't give a rat's ass that we're wasting time studying this thing," Glenn said. "I don't know. I think it makes sense, but I'm just not sure about the tongue. In that I saw," I said. I was in Glenn's hospital room a couple days after the asylum incident. I was eating his tray of hospital food while Glenn ate the burger I brought in. "Can I at least have some fries?" I asked. I tried to grab one, but Glenn swiped it away in time. He had great reflexes for such an old guy. "I've been eating that water soup for 3 days, kid," he said. I was still waiting on a replacement prosthetic arm, so I was one arm short of wrestling a piece of French fry out of his hands. "Doctors gave you that food for a reason," I said. I took a sip of his soup, and it was just water and vegetables. Didn't even have salt. I moved on to the pudding cup, and Glenn snatched it right out of the tray. These quacks don't own anything. The body needs meat and salt. "By the way, kid, good job saving Cal," Glenn said. "In the end, I think he saved me," I replied. Cal was transferred to the same medical facility, but the asylum patients were isolated from the rest of the hospital. While I was there, Glenn told me about the recent news he heard. The police had confirmed that the creature was bulletproof. Glenn heard about it from a nurse who had a friend in the police. One team encountered the creature at a far section of the pipes, somewhere near the docks. They were able to radio it in, but it was too late by the time everyone got there. It was gruesome. 3 of the 5 members were never found. The 2 bodies they did find. They had a fate similar to my arm. They lost muscle mass within a few hours, and they died. The nurse had pictures of the victims. They were skin and bones. Police investigators tried to extract as much information from the 2 dying members, but they were too weak to say anything. The only thing they got out was that that creature was bulletproof. Shattered bullets at the scene were proof enough. How do you kill something bulletproof? I asked Glenn. Bigger bullets, he replied. You mean like a tank or a missile? Glenn said, I'm starting to think you watched too many war movies, I replied. Just as I left Glenn's hospital room, I got a call from Diaz. He wanted to meet. He insisted, so I told him to meet me at the burger joint near the hospital. I was halfway through my burger when Diaz walked in carrying a metal case. He ordered his meal, and we got talking about creature theories. He'd gone back into the sewers after the asylum incident. They didn't encounter the creature, so he had a chance to get a closer look at the tunnels. They looked similar to the burrows of Komodo dragons. Booker, Pelton, and Diaz took a trip to Indonesia the previous year. They were cool, he said, like Jurassic Park dinos. He seemed enthusiastic about it. And then he showed me a picture. Pelton was posing with a Komodo dragon. It was a side profile of the animal while it was flicking its tongue. It was something. But it wasn't enough to doubt the other theories and switch over. The creature's tongue wasn't forked, and it didn't just flick. It snaked and moved as if it had a mind of its own. The eye I saw was maybe reptilian. I wasn't sure. And then Diaz told me about the time they were on patrol at the asylum ruins. They had a weird encounter in the sewers. He wasn't exactly sure if it was connected with a creature or not. Diaz and Booker were near one of the creature's tunnels. The SWAT team lent them their night vision goggles so they wouldn't attract the creature with their lights. They all had a cigarette. Diaz had to pause his story to thank me for the smoking advice. It worked like a charm, he said. In the dark tunnel just ahead of them was a policeman just standing there. Maybe it was a trick of the smoke interacting with their night vision goggles. But Diaz was sure that the guy had no head. Booker was sure that they were the only ones assigned to the area that day. And the guy's uniform looked very old. The headless policeman ran, and before they knew it, the 2 cops were in pursuit. For someone without a head, the guy was fast. Booker and Diaz were starting to run out of steam when the policeman stopped. Booker was pissed, he said. He pointed his rifle and ordered the headless guy to drop to the ground, and then the 2 soldiers heard something crawling on the tunnel ceiling. He told me it wasn't like anything he ever saw. It was different. They slowly looked up, and they saw a large centipede that could easily eat them both. They were lucky it was already preoccupied with something. Diaz couldn't quite see what the centipede was holding. His cheap government-issued night vision goggles were grainy, but he said it looked like a head, and with the way the policeman reacted, there was a good possibility that it was his head. The 2 soldiers were frozen in place, staring, while the headless policeman jumped and trying to reach the centipede on the ceiling. It scuttled quickly away with a headless policeman in quick pursuit. Before the guy disappeared at the bend, he turned to face them and saluted. The 2 cops were surprised. The headless policeman just stood there, tapping his foot. It must have been habit or muscle memory, but Booker and Diaz saluted back as if satisfied with that. The headless policeman continued his pursuit of the giant centipede. Booker and Diaz ran to that bend. It was blocked off by debris from the collapsed asylum. When they looked further, there was no sign of the headless policeman or the centipede. I wonder what would have happened if he didn't salute that guy, I said. Diaz just nodded deep in thought. We sat with Nate for a while. I wasn't sure how to react to his wild encounter. It was bizarre, and it made me think that the sewers were a far stranger place than I thought. I wondered what else could be down there. Then Diaz remembered the metal case he brought. He opened it, and there it was, the most awesome-looking prosthetic arm I've ever seen. It was made from some kind of alloy, light and sturdy. He forgot the arm's name, some fancy initials, and a number, he said. Diaz helped me get it on, and it felt like I had my arm back, but a much better version. I didn't know what the technology was, but it did whatever I intended it to do. It made my previous prosthetic seem like a piece of stick. I was speechless. This is too much, I said, but Diaz was happy to give it to me. He told me to consider it a gift from the three of them. I offered to pay for his burgers and all the burgers he and Booker could eat. He laughed. Before he headed out, he reminded me that the arm was still government property, and he begged me not to lose it. I returned to the hospital to show off my new arm to Glenn. He was walking through the hospital bridge. He was wearing jeans underneath his gown. He still had tubes attached to him while he pushed this wheeled metal pole that carried his bag of fluids. "Hey, new arm?" he asked. "Yeah, government property," I said. "Hey, good for you, kid. You can wipe your ass with taxpayer money," he replied. Glenn just chuckled and continued down the hospital bridge. "So where are we going?" I asked. "Well, they gave me the go-ahead to visit Cal," he said. Now, I wasn't sure if I wanted to see him or not. I still had whiplash from Cal's drastic changes. One minute he's okay, then he's not. So I wasn't sure if I fully liked this guy or thought he was completely crazy. I was okay with peaceful Cal, but crazy Cal was a lot to handle. It was a bit chaotic in that isolation area. Half the evacuated patients were crammed into one ward. There were rows of hospital beds lining the hallways, and every room held about 5 to 6 patients. A lot of them were tied to their beds, some were wandering around, and a few were by the windows. Cal was one of the window people. Glenn dragged a chair over and sat next to him for a while. They just looked out the window in silence. There was a storm brewing in the distance. The clouds were just visible above the cityscape. There was a moment when I thought the dark clouds had a slight purple tint. Must have been a trick of the light. It was gone after a moment. There was another asylum patient there with us. He was sitting in a wheelchair. Perched on his shoulder was a huge black and white stuffed crow, the kind I only saw in the Natural Museum when I was a kid. It looked so real, I wanted to touch it, but approaching an unknown asylum patient wasn't a smart thing to do. So I kept my distance and just watched the guy and the crow. Out of nowhere, the patient spoke. He told us that he got away safely because Tic Tac warned him. Then the guy pulled out a single green gummy bear from somewhere in his hospital gown and raised it to the crow's beak. I almost jumped in surprise when the crow moved. It snatched the green gummy bear from the patient's fingers and gulped it up in one smooth move. It was real. I could only watch as the black and white crow gave me a one-eyed stare before it flew away into the distance. "Everyone's got an animal sidekick," I whispered to Glenn. We watched the other patient wheel himself into one of the rooms. Glenn looked around for any hospital staff before pulling out his cigarette pack and lighting a stick. Then he handed it to Cal, who started puffing away. I took his lead and lit one of my own. I was pretty addicted at this point. Pretty soon we were all there, smoking and watching the clouds over the city. The fluorescent light above us flickered every few minutes. Glenn and Cal were wearing their hospital gowns, and there was a scent of alcohol and disease in the air, mixed with cigarette smoke, of course. "Cal, you remember when I was the only one who believed you?" Glenn asked. Cal nodded and said I never forgot. There was a slight tremble through his voice. It felt like that one word held a lot of emotion behind it. It must have been very difficult to be accused of killing his brother, and nobody believing in the monster he knew was real. "Back then, you were still too afraid to talk about what happened," Glenn said. Cal nodded and almost broke down at that. "Are you still afraid?" Glenn asked. Cal lifted his head and said no. He said he was angry. That thing killed his brother. "All right, then tell me everything that happened." "You know where that creature came from," Glenn said. Cal stared into the distant, dark clouds. There was a flash of lightning and a rumble in the skies. I felt like I was intruding on something personal, but I couldn't walk away. This was the real story of the Denton brothers. It started with a drought, Cal said. Glenn looked confused. Maybe it wasn't something he expected. I was still in school when the drought happened. It was a big deal back then. People called it the end of days. It was more than a year without rainfall. Water supply only came in about an hour per day. It got so bad at one point that people were leaving the city. Cal and Chris were sent to the lake because it was drying out. Cal told us that their job was just to clean up and clear blockages. The city's water supply mainly came from the massive lake. There were blocks of drying mud. It was blocking the water supply that could flow to the city. The Denton brothers went down, and there was only about knee-deep water left in the middle of it. People said that it was the first time in centuries that the lake was drained like that. There were dead fish everywhere, and the smell, my God, it was terrible, Cal said. He continued his story. The Denton brothers saw something peeking out just above the remaining water and mud. It was a stone statue, or it used to be. The details were lost, and it looked ancient. It was inserted into a base of solid rock. Without thinking, Chris lifted the stone statue and dislodged it completely from its base. Chris thought it'd be worth a lot of money to some museum people. Cal begged his brother to put it back. They could just call someone else to get it. But Chris argued that someone else might take it. He told us that Chris bagged the statue. It was the size of a toddler, lighter than wood and as hard as stone. Wait, what do you think it had to do with the creature? Glenn interrupted. Cal told us that even the thought of it still freaked him out. He took a deep and shaky hit from his cigarette and blew it out slowly. It was like he was afraid to say it. When Chris took the statue, Cal heard the inhale of the creature and a groan from somewhere beneath the mud. He told us that there was a time when he didn't believe in himself. Nothing happened after he heard those sounds. Days went by during the drought. The monster must have been stuck under all that mud, and then the drought ended, and the lake's water began to rise. He said that his brother Chris had sold the statue. The city rejoiced that day, even making it a holiday. They thought it was the end of their suffering. He told us that there wasn't anything weird then. Maybe a couple of missing fishermen and campers. I was getting anxious. He told us there was nothing until that night of the sewer flood. Cal grabbed Glenn then. It swallowed him, he said. He repeated that over and over. Glenn calmly held on to Cal's hands. Cal was sobbing at that point. We were practically strangers to each other, but there were only a few of us who'd survived this thing. Maybe we weren't complete strangers after all. I gestured quietly in Glenn. Maybe it was time to give Cal some privacy. He wasn't the peaceful Cal anymore. But Glenn never moved a muscle. He just sat there with his wrinkled hospital gown and his bag of fluid slowly dripping into his veins. He waited for Cal. Minutes went by with us practically unmoving. And then Cal slowly lifted his head and he gave me a genuine smile. I felt like it was the first time he realized I was even there. He asked me if I passed his message along to Glenn. Cal chuckled and then turned serious again. He told us that he wanted to make things right. This is also our burden. You remember that? Glenn added. I nodded. When Glenn and I decided to open that floodgate, we sealed our fate. We had to get rid of that thing, even if it killed us. We were dead anyway. If we drowned that day, the monster would still be trapped in that section. I should have stopped him, Cal told us. Yeah, and we should have drowned ourselves. Regrets are useless now, Glenn began. So you had any idea where the statue is now? Cal took a deep breath. I could see the internal struggle on his face. I was afraid he might snap again. In the end, he gave up the last of his secrets. He gave us 4 words: Natural Museum Aztec Exhibit. We sat with Cal for a while longer, until a staff member saw us smoking. Cal was taken into one of the rooms, and Glenn and I walked back to his side of the hospital. Glenn demanded to be released after our conversation with Cal, but he needed more tests first. So the next day, I reported everything we'd learned from Cal to HQ. Glenn even wrote it all down for me, so I wouldn't miss any detail. I didn't need that. The conversation with Cal would haunt me for a long time after my report. Booker and Diaz were assigned as my security detail and retrieved the statue from the Natural Museum. I was glad to see him again. I even joked around by hiding my head in my overalls, so I looked headless. Diaz laughed, but Booker told us it wasn't funny. He smiled when he thought I wasn't looking, and they gladly accepted my offer to buy them burgers for lunch. We made it to the museum, and the two cops slammed an official form onto the desk of the curator. It had the city stamp and everything. I wouldn't even be surprised if the document was signed by the mayor. That official document. It was like a golden ticket for us. If we asked for an entire T-Rex skeleton, we'd get it and more. Both the statue and the curator were brought into HQ. I wasn't told to leave the conference room, so I stayed and listened to what the curator had to say. I sat somewhere in the back. The curator was questioned by the same 5 people I reported to. They were accused of acquiring stolen items. The statue was technically government property because it was taken from the lake. The curator argued that the statue was an artifact from the Aztecs, ages before the formation of the U.S. government. The poor guy discovered that the people before him could not be argued with. He was required to aid in investigating the statue and how it related to the creature in the sewers. The curator agreed and started to share the history of the statue. There wasn't much to see. The statue was made of stone. It was eroded in several places. It might have been full of details in the past, but the elements had ruined it beyond recognition. I could barely see the long tongue, or maybe it was a tail. I wasn't sure. The curator started with a little history lesson. Aztecs were originally from Central America, and they expanded their empire from the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific Ocean. It felt like a lecture. The curator asked why the statue was this far north. Then he answered the question with a single word: symbols. The curator then asked Booker to flip the statue so the officials could see the carved symbols underneath. It was in the section of the statue that looked like it fit into the slot of the stone base. The base was still underneath the lake. He spent a long time translating the primitive language. He read it aloud. God of rain, God of life, winged serpent, mad god, killer of tribes, imprisoned god, exiled god. Some of the symbols were lost to erosion in time. So far, the curator could only extract those words. From there, he told us that the creature must have been in some kind of prison underneath the lake. The Aztecs considered it a god. When the creature started killing, they captured it and sent it far north. With that, he was assigned to the research teams and everyone was dismissed. There were multiple times when I wanted to talk to him, but I didn't get the chance to. I went back to the hospital and I told Glenn everything. Our talk of gods reminded Glenn of a story he heard from a policeman named Kurt. He'd been a friend of Glenn ever since they went on a rescue mission together. Dispatch called in a disturbance underneath the holy temple. There were complaints of digging sounds and stone rumbling late at night. The temple had always been a place for silent prayer. It was a peaceful place, smack in the middle of the city, like a little sanctuary. That night, the policeman who accepted the call felt that rumbling underneath their feet as they made their way into the temple. It had a direct link to the sewers through a large koi pond. They entered, and there were monks running the opposite direction. A few of them were injured, so some of the policemen stayed to take care of them. Kurt and another officer headed deeper into the sewer. Along the way, they saw murals painted onto the sewer walls. It depicted some sort of god that had a human body, but the head of a toad. There were monks worshipping it and multiple murals of this toad god standing over them. Glenn continued with the story. The rumbling of the rocks came again. Kurt's fellow officer cursed under his breath and ran back to the entrance. Kurt made a mental note to include it in his report later. He made it into a large chamber with flowers carved into stone walls. It was a similar scene to that of the murals. At the far end of the cathedral was a giant man with a toad for a head. The god was floating in midair with its legs crossed and arms on its lap. It was bound with thick chains that were attached to a large boulder about twice its size. The rock crawled across the cavern floor a few inches at a time, as if pulled by an unknown force. The rumbling made the cavern shake, and pieces of the walls started to crumble. He ran. It was way above his pay grade. As soon as he got out of the koi pond entrance, the cavern collapsed, and the temple was swallowed in by a huge sinkhole. After that incident, Kurt filed an urgent request for a transfer. He said his goodbyes to Glenn and shared his story with him. He told me that if you ever hear rumbling, you run, Glenn said. Do you think it's a real god? I asked. I don't know, he replied. A couple of days later, Glenn was discharged with a clean bill of health. I was waiting for him outside when they brought him out in a wheelchair. When he saw me, he simply got up and walked over. We stayed there for a while. He was in contact with our superiors, and we were both called in for a mission. After the discovery of the cave tunnels and the underground river, several teams were dispatched to the area. It was larger than Glenn thought and almost as extensive as the sewers. Other than the danger of the monster lurking inside, the tunnels also made the city engineers nervous. A huge chunk of the city could fall in if they collapsed. The use of explosives underground was immediately prohibited, and the gas pipes were disabled. People weren't happy about it, but the mayor promised them that the sewer crisis would be solved in a few months. Our mission this time, it wasn't the usual search and rescue, but data gathering. We were to go in, take a water sample from the underground river, and deliver it to Dr. Charlotte Nix. Simple enough. What could go wrong? I asked. We were just outside HQ then. Glenn looked at me like I slapped him in the face. You are attempting fate, kid. I couldn't help it. I was going into the sewers with Glenn, and I had a new high-tech prosthetic arm. It could carry up to 50 pounds, and it had a flashlight attached. I flexed, stretched, and I turned a light on to show it off. Glenn smiled. It was a rare thing. I was sure he remembered that we almost died because of a locked manhole cover. We made our way to an office building downtown. The asylum incident sparked another huge shift in the city. There were buildings like the asylum that were sitting on top of large sewer sections. These would easily be accessible to the creature, not to mention the risk of another sinkhole. People were urged to abandon their houses, and offices were shut down. These buildings were turned into operational stations where the police could enter the sewers easily. We made it to the office building. City Hall had upgraded the sewer entrances. It was no longer just a manhole cover surrounded by police tape. The covers only allowed one person at a time to climb down the rungs. The ramps could have a squad of policemen in the sewers in a matter of seconds. After being cleared for entry, we went down. The new upgrades were too clean for the crap rivers we were used to. Everything was reinforced steel and bright flood lines. Soon, we were back in the old system. We took a few turns, and in about an hour, we found the creature's tunnel that Glenn discovered when looking for the girl. He pulled out a couple of night vision goggles from his toolbox, the same ones Diaz told me about. Cheap and defective government property. You know, I remember when there were just tools in here, he said. Then he handed me goggles. We put them on and killed our lights before entering. It was a strange experience seeing everything with a green tint, but with my high-tech prosthetic arm, the cigarette and night vision goggles, I'd never felt so cool in my life. I could just imagine Glenn going through the tunnel that first time. He did it without any light while he followed the sounds of old Sarge. So far, there wasn't any sign of the creature. A part of me thought that it died in the asylum incident. But my gut was telling me otherwise, especially after I heard those words. Mad Dog, killer of tribes. The path curve ahead. Our footsteps were echoing. Now and then, Glenn would stop and listen. We came upon a large open area with several tunnels connected to it. The underground river ran through it. We moved along the river upstream. We were instructed to take the water as close as we could to the source. There were spots where we could only walk in single file, and even a point where we had to crab walk with our backs to the wall. Finally, we emerged into a larger chamber. The underground river flowed through it, its waters dark, and there was a sheet of ice on top. There were no other water sources beyond the chamber. It was a good place to take the sample. I dipped a test tube into the cold water suddenly. Something took hold of my prosthetic, and it pulled me in. The shock drove the air out of my lungs, and I lost the sample. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, the night vision goggles messed up. There was a small icon of water blinking at the corner. The goggles died, and I was in complete darkness while I was dragged deeper into freezing waters. I would have been a complete goner if Glenn didn't dive in. With his help, I broke away from the monster's grip. We were about to swim to the surface when we felt a strong current pulling both of us. It all happened so fast. We were sucked into some kind of pressurized tunnel. After a few minutes in the tube, I ran out of air and lost consciousness. The next thing I knew, Glenn and I broke the surface of the water. We were both catching our breaths and coughing. We were in the middle of the lake. That area was 2 hours from the city. That tube must have brought us miles away. I didn't know how long I passed out, but that trip was fast. Glenn was there, floating beside me. I took hold of his collar and swam to the shore. We needed to get out of there. The creature might still be after us. His teeth were chattering. Snow was starting to fall, and the whole lake was dark and silent. Instead of an ambulance taking us directly to the hospital, we were forced to go back to HQ and report. The City Hall people were there waiting for us in the water sample. Glenn and I were bundled in tinfoil. They called it hypothermia blankets. It wasn't cozy, but it worked. When they saw us without a sample, they got angry. They didn't even let us make our report. They told us it was such a simple job and we failed. The mayor was facing protests from angry parents so close to election period because of us. The loss of that little girl made a big impact, and we were fired from search and rescue and suspended as sewer workers. Outside the conference room, a woman in a lab coat was waiting for us. She introduced herself as Dr. Charlotte Nix and asked for the water sample. We ignored her and walked away. If she still wanted her sample, she could collect the puddle from our dripping clothes. After that, Glenn and I headed for the nearest burger joint. Our clothes were still wet and we still had our tinfoil blankets. Our burgers came and there was a large serving of fries just for me. Right before we took a bite, Glenn stopped and looked out the window at the snow falling. Well, happy Thanksgiving, kid. I stopped mid-bite and realized he was right. I forgot it was that time of the year. We were too focused on this creature. Yeah, happy Thanksgiving to you too, I guess. It might have been the trauma, the near drowning or freezing, but that night that burger never tasted so good, especially the fries. We spent the next couple of days recovering. Glenn and I had our hospital beds in the same room, and I couldn't complain. The hospital was 10 times better than my cockroach apartment. We were fired, but at least we still got the perks, and they didn't take my arm back. Glenn was content with watching old war movies on the TV in the corner while I tinkered around with my prosthetic. On the third day, Glenn and I snuck out of the hospital. We went to a local bar, a kind with peeling paint and the faint smell of stale beer. The place was lit with Christmas lights from the ceiling. We grabbed the corner booth and ordered a round of beers. Booker and Diaz were at the next booth. They were nursing their drinks and looking like they'd been through the ringer. I introduced them both to Glenn, and we all shared a table. All right, spill it. Policemen that looked troubled make me nervous, Glenn said. Booker took a long swig of his beer and then told us the story of his squad. Their mission was to kill the creature. It was a joint effort from 3 precincts, about 30 policemen. Dear, Charlotte Nix had apparently figured out how to kill it. The City Hall rep mandated that Dr. Nix's bee theory was the way to go about things. They brought in pesticides that kill bees, several drums worth of it. Instead of guns, the policemen had pump sprayers like the ones farmers use. But what about the reptile theory? I began. The curator said it was a winged serpent, right? The cops just shrugged at that. The city rep called the shots. The mayor wanted the issue over and done with, so the reptile theory was discarded. They saw new tunnels that weren't there a week ago, and went through one that led to this massive chamber. The walls were covered in this strange substance, and the air was thick with sulfur. They pushed through, pump sprays ready. The chamber was even bigger than they thought, like an underground cathedral. In the middle of the chamber was a large structure made from some hardened substance. It had multiple strands attached to the ceiling, the walls, and the floor that kept it in place. Everything was confirmed when Dr. Nix stepped forward. She proclaimed that her theory about the bees was right. Some of the cops had to quiet her down. She celebrated like they weren't steps away from the creature's nest. They approached the structure. It looked like a beehive as big as a 2-story house. When they got closer, They saw that it was reinforced with bones, human and animal. One of the cops vomited. Dear. Nix, on the other hand, I was astonished. She moved closer and studied the edges of the hive with keen interest. She took a flashlight and pointed at it. The effect was immediate. The whole nest lit up like a gruesome nightlight. The cops wearing night vision goggles had to look away. The cops who didn't have their goggles all pointed their pump spray right at the nest. The creature was inside. Diaz saw eggs in there too. The monster crawled out of the hive. It was acting differently. In the past, the creature picked 2 or 3 victims and then ran off to feed. This time it went crazy. Diaz told us that they weren't sure if the sprays worked. Everything was chaotic. It was too fast for them, and they could barely see it. They lost Dr. Nix. The surviving policemen were suspended. So there we were, 4 suspended government workers all at one table. I felt like it was the start of a joke. Glenn took a long pull from his beer, his eyes fixed on the table. Well, what's their plan now? He asked. Booker and Diaz exchanged a look. Diaz spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. He had a cousin working in the city hall, the one who lent us my arm. They were told that Dr. Nix was already considered dead and that they'd fill the whole sewer system with pesticides. It was a stupid plan. Glenn and I both knew that even if the pesticide worked, the creature would just escape to the lake. Diaz told us that it was an order from the mayor. Smoke the thing out. It would either be driven out of the sewers, or it would die. They were treating it like a bad mosquito problem. All exits and entrances would be blocked. I could almost see the cogs inside Glenn's brain working over this problem. Those toxic gases would kill anyone caught in the sewers. Dear, Nix and a couple of police officers might still be alive. Hey, Glenn, they fired us, remember? I said, we just lost the title, kid. It's still our responsibility. I was reminded that we were the ones who unleashed this thing. We had to save everyone we could. The 2 cops looked at us. Their despair earlier was replaced with determination. They promised to help us. I was surprised that Booker was fully into it. They would leave one exit open for us, the one that led to the docks. Glenn and I exchanged a look. It was a bad plan. If we failed to find the doctor and the missing cops in time, there was a big possibility that we'd be down there suffocating on deadly fumes. Well, guess we might as well enjoy these beers, Glenn said. We clinked our bottles together, the sound echoing through the bar. We drank the rest of our beers while we went through the details of our rogue rescue mission. Then the 2 cops went home and promised to meet us at the locked manhole near the lake. It was the only one they could think of that wasn't guarded by the police. Glenn and I separated after drinks. I went to my apartment to prepare my equipment. Glenn went back to the hospital, saying that he needed something important for the mission. Hours later, I was surprised to find Cal Denton with Glenn. He looked better than last time. His cheekbones weren't as pronounced compared to when we visited him at the hospital, but there was fear in his eyes. We were at the entrance near the floodgates. The metal bar holding the cover was bent, and there was a piece of shovel stuck in between. After all that time, our IDs were somehow right where we left them. I picked him up and brushed the dirt off him. I kept mine, and I handed Glenn's his. He looked at it with surprise, as if he forgot it. It was just me, Glenn, Cal, Booker, and Diaz. We were all ready. Diaz handed me an AC-4 charge. He explained that it had a timer and a detonator. Without those 2 things, it wouldn't blow up that easily. It wouldn't detonate with gunshots or fire, so the rule about smoking was still good. Glenn placed the C4 charge in his toolbox. It was supposed to be prohibited in the sewers because the tunnels might collapse. Since we were going to jail anyway, we might as well do that too. Diaz also apologized that he couldn't get us night vision goggles. With everyone deployed on the field, there weren't many left. That's all right. We got something better. Glenn said Booker gave me a smoke bomb. He told me to use it only in the event of an emergency and never hold it in my hands when it set off because it could get burning hot. Booker and Diaz waved to us before they left. Then Glenn, Cal, headed down using the familiar metal rungs. We were all on high alert. The water level was up to our knees as the three of us made our way to the floodgate. I waited a bit closer to Glenn, leaving Cal at the rear. The poor guy was hugging Glenn's toolbox like a teddy bear. I didn't know how stable Cal was, but Glenn insisted that Cal deserved to be down here with us. I'm not going to deny him redemption, kid. Isn't it more like revenge? I asked. Well, he's entitled to both. Cal looked terrified, but he kept going forward. He was determined to see it through. We made it to the platform beside the floodgate. Cal Denton looked like he was on the verge of a meltdown, but Glenn was there to calm him down. Remember why you're here, Cal? For Chris. Before I could say anything, the old man got down to business. Our rogue mission was to locate the missing scientist and the cops. We were in the middle of a police operation to smoke out the monster with pesticide. There were multiple guards we had to avoid. Thankfully, Booker marked all spots on the map. With that, we had a route carefully plotted. The important part was keeping a low profile. We had to go through everything without lights. This was Cal's purpose. He saw very well in the dark, and he led us away from the guards. There was part of me wondering if I was going to make it out of here. I felt like I was running out of luck. There were moments when Cal got anxious, especially on close calls with the police, but Glenn was patient with him every time. The first policeman who caught us was wearing night vision goggles. When the guard raised his voice, he caught the creature's attention. We didn't see what happened to him, but we could hear the creature drag him away. We were safe until we got to a junction where the tunnel split into three. We were supposed to take the left tunnel, but it was flooded. The tunnel only had a few inches of air before the water touched the ceiling. But the temperature was the real problem. The cold made it difficult to breathe. The dark water played tricks on my mind. I was afraid something might pull me under. It felt like an eternity before we emerged into the large chamber. Booker was right. It was like a cathedral. A small village could fit in there. The hive dominated almost half of it. There was a faint sound, like groaning. Coming from the hive, it looked like there was a person trapped within it, a cop from Booker's squad. There were others, but they were already dead. We freed the poor guy, but it was too late. He died in Glenn's arms with a few last words. He told us that the doctor might still be alive, and we found her. We found Dr. Nix inside a small hole in the wall. At first, I thought it was a small pile of clothes and a lab gown. Turned out to be her. She was alive, but barely. Her arms and legs had lost all muscle. We had to get her out of there fast. Glenn and I carried her out of the hole, but Cal was nowhere to be found. He just disappeared. And as much as we wanted to stay and get him out of there, Dr. Nix was dying. And the creature would soon be back, and the sewer would soon be filled with toxic pesticides. But we couldn't leave him. We had to find a way to save them both. Glenn and I made it past the hive and the flooded tunnel, but it was far from over. The pesticides were coming in, and we couldn't see Cal anywhere. There was a thick fog of smoke and chemicals coming right our way. We didn't know which path to take. Cal still had the map, I realized, and the fog was almost hitting us. And then I saw a pair of eyes coming from the fog for a moment. I thought it was a monster. And then a large German shepherd walked up to us, and it licked Glenn's hand. Old Sarge barked once and led us into the tunnels. He even led us to Cal, who was hiding inside a cluster of pipes. But there was a sort of calm on his face that I hadn't seen before, and Glenn asked him if he could take the doctor to safety. All he had to do was follow old Sarge. Cal had to go ahead because we still had something to finish. Cal nodded, and he gave Glenn the map of the sewers. Old Sarge gave both of us a lick and then ran off. It was just the two of us, and I felt like we were up against very bad odds. But we had one goal. We had to make sure the creature did not escape to the lake. I knew we probably wouldn't make it out. And I know this sounds silly, but at that moment, for some reason, I asked something. Glenn, before we do this, could you maybe knight me into search and rescue? I asked. I'm not sure it works that way, kid. Besides, you already saved lives. You saved Cal and the doctor, Glenn replied. I know it's just that if I die, I want to die knowing I was an official member, you know? Glenn softened. Then he pulled out his wrench from his toolbox. He held it up as if it was a sword. Kneel down, kid. I found myself kneeling in a river of crap, but somehow it felt like a huge honor. I bowed my head. Glenn tapped me on the right shoulder with his wrench and stepped back. You're official, kid. Now stand up. After that, I felt my legs were stronger and my back straighter. I was ready to face whatever was ahead of us. Moments later, we were at the creature's nest when Glenn pulled out the C4. That was when his crazy plan made sense to me. The thing went on a rampage when the cops came. I couldn't imagine what it would do to us if we blew up the nest. Glenn argued that placing the bomb inside it would have maximum damage. He was right. He threw his arms in the air when the nest exploded. Some of the hive walls collapsed. After months of losing to this creature, it felt like it was our first win. Unfortunately, the chamber's ceiling was starting to cave in. It would develop into a full-on sinkhole in a matter of minutes. And then Glenn saw something. In the middle of the hive were two large eggs. Their shadows were unmistakable. The eggs cracked open and figures came out, but they stopped and burned with the heat. And then we saw the creature. The section of the chamber's far wall melted and a small hole slowly grew in size. It was time to go. We ran. There was part of my brain that went numb while we were trying to get away. All my trust was in Glenn. At that point, I focused on keeping myself next to him. My sides were beginning to burn, and I was sure that we'd passed the underground river. When I started to smell the brine scent of the ocean, I knew we were almost there. The docks had two exits. We reached the closest one, but it was closed and blocked off with a thick slab of metal, and then the creature caught up to us. The pesticide affected it, but it wasn't enough to stop the damn thing. It looked to have chemical burns, but if anything, that only made it angrier. Every tool I had was useless, except for Booker's smoke bomb. It was an effective distraction for the creature, but the thing still got to Glenn and grabbed him. We heard a voice. Then it was Diaz. They came through with their promise. The exit opened behind us. Somehow I managed to pull Glenn closer to the door. Diaz was offering his hand, but before I could reach him, the creature came after me. Just as it was about to grab me, Glenn pushed me back, lowered his head, and ran directly at it. I felt like time stood still then. I could only watch as Glenn and the creature fell into the docks and sank under the water. I didn't even realize my arm fell with him. I wanted to jump after him, but Diaz held me back. Booker had the presence of mind to call the Coast Guard search and rescue team. They had boats and divers at the docks in a matter of minutes, and I didn't find out if Glenn survived. The police arrested us, brought us to HQ, and we were accused of going against their orders. Booker and Diaz were even stripped of their badges. We spent a week in jail. All I wanted to know was if Glenn was okay. I kept repeating that moment in my head. I wondered if there was anything I could have done to save him. There was a public outrage following the fumigation of the entire sewer system. It caused breathing problems throughout the entire city. This was the people's breaking point. Citywide protests led to the removal of the mayor. After that, a quick election was held, and the chief of police became the new mayor. He granted us amnesty for our services to the city. Booker and Diaz were given promotions. When it came to me, I finally got what I wanted. I heard about Glenn. I was sent to the hospital, half expecting someone to take me to the morgue instead. I was led to Glenn's hospital room. The old man was alive and kicking. He was eating a burger, and Cal was giving him a strange look. "Hey kid, sorry we couldn't get you out quicker." That previous mayor did not like us. I held back tears and nodded. There was a silence between us. I was fighting the urge to walk over and hug the old man. My eyes drifted to his prosthetic arm. "Well, it looks like we have matching arms." "Oh, yeah, speaking of that, I got yours right here," he replied. I put it back on, and I felt complete again. They told me the story of how Glenn survived. The Coast Guard search and rescue team saw something floating in the distance when they moved closer. It was a black and gray German shepherd paddling. That dog is everywhere. Old Sarge boarded the boat and pointed the officers to a spot in the water. They found Glenn, but there was no sign of the creature. I made a mental note to have dog treats in my pocket at all times. The next time I encountered Old Sarge, I would make sure to thank him properly. You know, kid, it's not crazy to assume that that creature is still out there, Glenn said. The two of them shared a look before they told me the news. Search and rescue never found the creatures in the nest. All they found were empty eggs. After that day, a lot of changes happened to the city. Tunnels were reinforced so there wouldn't be another sinkhole. They were closely watching the lake and the ocean near the city, and the new government invested a lot of money in various search and rescue agencies. A month later, and after a couple of very interesting psych evals, Cal Denton and I were officially inducted into the Search and Rescue Team Sewers Division. Glenn was there. He had a cigarette in between his lips while he placed a pin on our breast pockets. He tousled my hair with his remaining hand. Well, there you go, kid. You're official. You know, I prefer that time when it unites me with a wrench, I replied. Glenn chuckled, placed himself in between Cal and I, and put his arms on our shoulders. I smiled. I had my friends, my cigarette, my toolbox, and a pocket full of dog treats. That was all I needed to survive. Hey, okay, so tonight I'm going to be reading some truths. Scary sewer stories from the audience. So let's do it. Alright, first one, Steve the Wizard says. Old story, but my grandfather told me a story once about a guy who the neighborhood called Manhole Marv. The long and short of it was a guy in the area was accused of murder, and Marv escaped into the sewer, and he would only pop out of the manhole every so often. Okay, so first off, this sounds a lot like the plot to Home Alone. I believe Marv was thwarted by an 8-year-old boy named Macaulay Culkin. Moving on, he would only pop out of the manhole every so often. I didn't believe it until Christmas night when I saw prints in the snow going from the trash can to the manhole cover. I have no idea if they ever caught Marv. They did. They caught Marv in 1996, I believe thanks to Macaulay Culkin. He used paint cans, a blowtorch, and Christmas ornaments, and then they caught him. He was part of a crime syndicate called the Wet Bandits. A really interesting story. I have no idea if they ever caught him. They did. I don't think I'll ever know. That was a good one. Okay, next one, Jared Hetler says, when I first met my wife, I took her to the inside of a bridge with a sewer type of section. Yes, the best place to take women on the first date. The only way in or out was a manhole with a long ladder that was very unstable. We were sitting not 15 or 20 feet from the ladder off the side of the bridge. When out of view from around the corner, we both clearly heard a person climb down and jump down at the bottom of the ladder. That's creepy. No other noises after that. After 5 minutes of hearing no movement, I went and looked. Nobody was there. We would have heard them go back up. There was nowhere to hide. It was an empty circular room with a long ladder. A really strange situation that made us very uneasy. If I was your wife, I'd also be uneasy that you took me to the inside of a bridge. I'm just kidding. That's good. That's the best first date location for sure. Inside of bridges. It's free. It's terrifying. Anyway, that was a cool story. Thank you. Okay, so the third one. Silicon. I don't know. I can't pronounce anything. Alright, so 9 years ago, me 14, him 13, my friend and these. I'm loving these stories so far. My friends and I went to this place we refer to as a hobo camp. By the way, hobo, one of the best words in the English language. It's got to be in the top 10. It was a tiny abandoned facility surrounded by a forest of trees and overgrowth near his home on the left side of Highway 190 heading north in southern Louisiana. That's what I can do. I can picture. That's a cool visual. We went there every weekend to mess around with the stuff, but one weekend we discovered a tar pit in the back reaches behind the building. Wow, that is very interesting. We started throwing big branches and rocks into it for fun. What seemed to be deep black tar covered bones and decaying flesh came to the surface. We fished some of it out and looked at it, assuming it to be the remains of deer carcasses or something. Really not thinking much of it, the very next week we went. An older man, about 60, stepped out of the opposing brush a ways away, and without a moment of hesitation, began to rush towards us from the other side of the little compound. We bolted through the trees, made it back to my buddy's home. On the way, I noticed a 1980s Ford F-150 parked on the side of the highway. We chose not to go back for a whole 5 years, but when we went back, we saw the tar pit was nearly entirely emptied, and many of the abandoned electronic materials scattered about before were gone. All the things we destroyed and all the glasses we'd broken remained, so it wasn't some local cleaning job or restoration. 24 and 23 now. We still go down there and check it out every now and then. When I come back down south to visit, nothing's changed, nor has the man or the truck reappeared. The abandoned facility stands the same to this day. Is this a horror story? Not quite, but it is something that was extremely frightening to us at the time. I'd say it's a horror story, most certainly. We did manage to salvage an original, unfunctional Macintosh and many floppy disks from our time spent nearly a decade ago. It's a good story. I've never seen a tar pit that now. I want to look that up. That sounds crazy. That's interesting. Okay, next one. Jeremy Officer says, I don't have any sewer stories, but I have seen some standing in a canal past the drop-off point where there wouldn't have been any footing. I've seen someone standing. It was at night, and I was on my way to the bar. He asked for a smoke, and I would normally oblige, but it felt like I was in arm's reach. I would have been. It felt like I would have been snatched up by something in the water, like he was the lure of an anglerfish. Yeah, it's creepy. Okay, Starless Night Dragon says, I heard screams coming from the sewers once. I went to check it out, and I saw nothing. Even asked if anybody was down there and needed help. No reply. I saw something move in the corner, but it was gone a moment later, so I passed it off as some random noise that sounded like a scream due to echoes and that my eyes had played tricks on me. Who knows, maybe it was something. Okay, Grumpy Gills Fishing. These names are good too. I climbed down into a storm drain in a subdivision with some friend of mine once. We crawled around in there for a while. Nothing spooky happened, but I'm sure the noises we made while in the drainage system are haunting some poor soul to this day. Yeah, probably maybe the other people writing these comments. Azarian42 says on a trip to NYC once, I slipped into an open manhole. After a short walk, I stumbled upon 4 humanoid turtle creatures and what appeared to be a giant rat in a robe. Man, that's crazy. You know, this also reminds me, funny enough, of a 1990s movie, but I'm sure there's no relation. As if that wasn't scary enough, they all had weapons. That's crazy. They sound like interesting characters down there. Okay, CTFP4SE says I lost a shoe once because it got stuck in the drain, and when I couldn't get it back, I went home and my grandma yelled at me because they were new shoes, threatened me with a sandal. Rejecting Humanity's Return to Monk says not the sewers exactly, but back in my home country, we have small canals that floodwaters can flow into, and are connected to the sewers. I don't know if you'll find this creepy, but I found a ring in a canal when I was a kid. Yeah, I found that creepy. I find that creepy about 6 to 7 years old. And I kept that ring with me for years until it somehow disappeared. When we moved to a new city, it was obviously a ring for a man. It was gold, and it had a dragon stamped on its square bezel. The ring also had parallel lines going all around its band, and it was big, like a graduation ring. It sure was unique. Fast forward several years, I was given a ring by my mother saying my grandfather wanted me to have it. He died that year. It was this huge gold ring with parallel lines going through its band, and it had a dragon design on its square bezel. I didn't take it, by the way. It just felt weird. Did he find my ring and kept it for himself all these years, or was it a different ring with an identical design? Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, Novena Gray, 98 says sewer store. My dad worked for the city of Chicago for years on the sewers. He came home one day and told us a story I will never forget. He said they were working on the sewers directly underneath downtown. This was back in the 70s. They were just finishing up a job when one of the guys on his crew had still been down in the sewer finishing up. They were all up top already. My dad said the guy came up and looked horrified. He said the guy threw off his hard hat and kept walking without saying as much as a word to them and went into a bar that was about a block away. He said when they went to check on the guy, he was crying and talking nonsense, saying there was something bad down there. The crew boss called his wife, and she came and had to call for paramedics. Fast forward. My dad said he ran into the guy's wife around 10 years after that. She said he never recovered and had been in mental health ever since. Oh, it's crazy. I had a mental breakdown there. Saw something down there. Okay, Frog in Progress says not yet. My area is not yet. Not yet. What? You don't have one yet? Not yet. My area's utility provider is forcing everyone off septic tanks and onto city-run sewer over the next few years, and we want to continue to get water and electricity. So I may be here in a short while. Given the weird crap that already goes on around here, I may be writing my own scary stories about sewers. Yume. Okay, JK Glitch says, not really a sewer, but we had this crawl space behind our old house that acted as a sort of waterway, so that rainwater would flow to the back of this property and into the gutter. When it wasn't raining, my sisters and I would make it a game to crawl through it and see who could make it out the other end the fastest. It was only about 15 meters. But to this day, we swore it would always get longer and longer each time we crawled through it. That's creepy. That's creepy. That makes me think of a bunch of different stories. That's creepy. Okay, I think this. Alright, so last comment. This is my last comment. It is JMM5106 says, I wasn't one for hanging out in sewers, but hopefully you can use this for your imagination with my experience to make a great story. Alright, so he's got an experience. Okay? One particular day, there was a ton of rain coming down so hard and fast. It was like the mobile home was getting hit by a tidal wave and I lived in a city. By the time the rain stopped, and I was surrounded. By the time the rain stopped, I was surrounded by water. I learned on the news that cars were underwater. The expressway, partially underground, was filled all the way up to the bridge, crossing over. The rainwater was caused by the immediate filling up of water. Plus, the sewer couldn't handle the overloading, so it backed up and took over several cities nearby. In the aftermath, the city was taken over by a rat infestation. So I saw an angry woman get so mad she grabbed a dead rat in the middle of the street with her bare hands and threw it as far as she could away from her house. This took place in Detroit Heights in 2014. True story.